Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true camping horror stories that will make you reconsider ever venturing into the wilderness alone. These are not fictional tales created for entertainment, but genuine accounts from people who experienced unexplainable terror in some of the most remote and isolated locations across North America. Each story has been meticulously compiled from first-hand testimonials, incident reports, and investigative research that confirms these events actually occurred. From national park campgrounds to backcountry wilderness areas, the places we seek for peace and solitude can sometimes harbor dangers that defy rational explanation. What you are about to hear includes encounters with human predators who stalk the vulnerable, unexplained phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, and mysteries that remain unsolved to this very day. If you appreciate genuine horror content grounded in real experiences that will leave you unsettled long after the video ends, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our latest deep dives into documented cases of the unknown. After you finish listening to these harrowing accounts, we encourage you to share your own camping experiences or unexplained encounters in the comments section below, as your stories help build our community of truth seekers. Now settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we journey into the darkness that awaits those who dare to camp where civilization ends. Liam had been planning the camping trip for months. After a brutal year of working overtime at the accounting firm, he desperately needed to disconnect from spreadsheets, emails, and the constant hum of city life. His girlfriend Sarah had been equally enthusiastic about the idea. They researched remote campgrounds across 3 states before settling on a national park in northern Montana, a place known for its rugged beauty and sparse visitor traffic. The park ranger they spoke with on the phone assured them that late October was the perfect time to visit. Most tourists had already left for the season, and the fall colors would be at their peak. What the ranger did not mention was that the isolation could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with wildlife. They arrived at the trailhead parking area on a Friday afternoon as the sun began its descent toward the mountain ridgeline. The parking lot could accommodate maybe 20 vehicles, but only one other car was there when they pulled in. It was a dusty, dark blue SUV with Idaho plates, parked at an odd angle that took up 2 spaces. Liam noticed that the vehicle had seen better days. The rear bumper was dented, one taillight was cracked, and the windows were tinted darker than seemed legal. Something about it felt off, but he dismissed the feeling as urban paranoia. Out here in the wilderness, people drove rough vehicles. It meant nothing. They shouldered their packs and started down the trail. The hike to their chosen campsite was only 3 miles, but the terrain was challenging. The path climbed steadily through dense forest, crossing several small creeks and navigating around massive boulders that looked like they had tumbled from the cliffs above sometime in the distant past. Sarah was in good spirits, pointing out interesting mushrooms and the occasional bird darting through the underbrush. Liam found himself relaxing with each step, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders as the sounds of civilization faded behind them. They reached their campsite just as twilight began to settle over the forest. It was a beautiful spot. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a fire ring made of blackened stones at its center. A weathered wooden post marked the site with a faded number 7. They set up their tent with practiced efficiency, having camped together enough times to work as a team without needing to communicate much. Within an hour, they had their shelter secure, their sleeping bags rolled out, and a small fire crackling cheerfully in the ring. Liam heated water for freeze-dried meals while Sarah organized their supplies. As darkness fully descended, they noticed something strange. The forest was quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening, but an oppressive silence that felt unnatural. No owls hooted in the distance. No small animals rustled through the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have died completely, leaving the pine branches motionless against the star-filled sky. Sarah mentioned it first, her voice uncertain as she looked around at the dark trees encircling their small bubble of firelight. Liam tried to reassure her. Perhaps they were between animal territories. Perhaps the local wildlife was simply elsewhere tonight. But even as he spoke, he felt the wrongness of it. He had spent enough time in wild places to know that forests were never truly silent. There was always something moving, always some creature going about its nocturnal business. This stillness felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They finished their meal and sat by the fire for another hour, talking quietly about their plans for the weekend. They would explore some of the less traveled trails tomorrow, maybe find a good spot for wildlife photography. Sarah had brought her camera specifically to capture some of the park's resident elk. Eventually, as the fire burned down to coals and the cold began to seep through their jackets, they decided to turn in for the night. Liam doused the remaining embers thoroughly, a habit drilled into him by years of responsible camping. They crawled into their tent, zipped it shut, and settled into their sleeping bags. Liam checked his watch one last time before turning off his headlamp. It was just past 11. He closed his eyes and listened to Sarah's breathing slow as she drifted toward sleep. He was nearly asleep himself when he heard the first footstep. It was unmistakable. The soft crunch of a boot on fallen pine needles, somewhere just outside the ring of darkness surrounding their tent. Liam's eyes snapped open. He lay perfectly still, every sense suddenly alert. Another step, then another. Someone was walking around their campsite in a slow circle, their footfalls deliberate and measured. Sarah stirred beside him, her hand finding his arm in the darkness. She had heard it too. Neither of them spoke. They barely breathed. The footsteps continued, maintaining that same steady pace, circling the tent again and again. Liam's mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps another camper had gotten lost and was looking for their own site. Perhaps it was a ranger doing some kind of night patrol. But why would anyone walk in circles without calling out or using a light? Then the voice came, and Liam's blood went cold. "Hello in the tent. This is Park Ranger Davidson. I need you to come out here, please." The voice was male, probably middle-aged, with a flat effect that sounded wrong somehow. There was no warmth in it, no concern, just a mechanical quality that made the hairs on the back of Liam's neck stand up. Liam found his voice, though it came out rough. "What is this about?" "This area has been closed due to an emergency situation. All campers need to evacuate immediately. I need you to pack your things and come with me right now." Something about the phrasing bothered Liam. Park rangers did not work alone at night. They traveled, yet in pairs for safety, and always used radios. And if there was a genuine emergency requiring evacuation, there would be multiple personnel, vehicles, probably even helicopters depending on the situation. This lone voice in the darkness, offering no explanation and no evidence of authority, set off every alarm bell in Liam's mind. "Can you show me your identification?" Liam called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "And can you tell me what the emergency is?" There was a long pause. The footsteps had stopped. Liam could sense the person standing just outside the tent, considering how to respond. When the voice came again, there was an edge to it that had not been there before. "I do not have time for this. You need to come out here now. Grab your things and follow me." "Where is your vehicle?" Liam pressed. "Rangers do not hike out to campsites without transportation. Where are you parked?" Another pause, longer this time. Sarah had moved closer to Liam. her hand now gripping his arm tightly. He could feel her trembling in the darkness. His own heart was pounding so hard, he was certain it must be audible outside the tent. "My truck is down the trail. You will follow me to it. Both of you need to come out now." Liam made a decision. "We are not leaving this tent. If you are actually a ranger, you can radio for backup, and we will speak to multiple officers. Otherwise, we are staying right here until morning." The silence that followed was worse than anything that had come before. It stretched on for seconds that felt like hours. Then the footsteps resumed, but this time they did not circle. They stopped directly in front of the tent door, no more than 3 feet from where Liam and Sarah lay. "Open this tent." The voice was different now, stripped of any pretense of authority. It was low and threatening, with an undercurrent of barely controlled rage. "Open it now, or I will open it for you." Liam's hand moved slowly to his pack, feeling for the knife he kept there. It was a small folding blade, meant for cutting rope and preparing food. But it was better than nothing. His fingers closed around it just as he saw the shadow. The moon had risen while they had been talking, and its pale light was just strong enough to make shapes visible through the tent's mesh windows. The shadow of a man stood at the tent entrance, tall and broad-shouldered. But there was no uniform visible, no radio antenna, no ranger hat. Just the silhouette of someone wearing what looked like a heavy jacket and a baseball cap. The figure stood there for what might have been 5 minutes, or might have been an hour. Time lost all meaning in that darkness, with that presence looming over their fragile nylon shelter. Liam could hear breathing now, heavy and steady, almost like the person was working to control their anger. He tightened his grip on the knife and positioned himself between Sarah and the tent door, ready to fight if it came to that. Then, without warning, the figure moved, but instead of attacking the tent, it simply stepped back into the darkness. The footsteps receded a few yards and then stopped. Liam realized with horror that the person had not left. They were still there, just outside the reach of the moonlight, watching and waiting. The hours that followed were the longest of Liam's life. He and Sarah lay rigid in their sleeping bags, neither sleeping nor speaking, listening to the occasional rustle that indicated their unwanted visitor was still present. Twice more during the night, they heard footsteps circling the tent. Once, something scraped against the tent fabric, a sound like fingers dragging across the nylon. But the mysterious person never tried to force entry. They simply maintained their vigil, a predator content to wait. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees, Liam heard footsteps one last time. But these were different, purposeful and departing, moving away from the campsite and down the trail toward the parking area. He waited another 30 minutes until the forest was fully illuminated by morning sun before daring to unzip the tent. The campsite looked exactly as they had left it. Their packs sat where they had placed them. The fire ring was undisturbed. But when Liam walked the perimeter of the camp, he found the footprints. Dozens of them, circling the tent in overlapping loops, pressed deep into the soft earth. They were made by large boots, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive waffle pattern on the soles. They packed with frantic speed, barely speaking, both of them desperate to get out of that place. The hike back to the trailhead took half the time it had taken to hike in. When they emerged into the parking lot, Liam's truck was still there, exactly where they had left it. But the blue SUV was also still there, sitting in those same 2 spaces, looking even more sinister in the daylight. Liam did not hesitate. He pulled out his phone, grateful to finally have cell service again, and called the park ranger station. He reported everything: the man claiming to be a ranger, the all-night stalking, the vehicle in the parking lot. The ranger he spoke with sounded genuinely alarmed and promised to send someone immediately. They waited in their locked truck for 45 minutes until a ranger vehicle arrived. 2 actual rangers emerged, both in proper uniform, both carrying radios. Liam told them the entire story while they inspected the blue SUV from a safe distance. One of them called in the license plate. The response over the radio made both rangers exchange a grim look. The vehicle was registered to a man named Carl Mitchell. He was a convicted felon with a history of violent assault and attempted kidnapping. He had served 8 years in prison and been released on parole 14 months earlier. His last known address was in Idaho, but he had failed to report to his parole officer 6 weeks ago. There was an active warrant for his arrest. One ranger stayed with Liam and Sarah, while the other called for backup. Within an hour, the small parking lot was filled with law enforcement vehicles. They searched the SUV, and what they found turned Liam's stomach. In the back cargo area, they discovered zip ties, duct tape, a hunting knife, and a length of rope. In the glove box were handwritten notes describing the park's remote campsites and the typical patterns of visitors. Carl Mitchell was never found. Despite an extensive search of the park and the surrounding wilderness, he vanished without a trace. Dogs lost his scent a mile from the trailhead. Helicopters saw no sign of him. It was as if he had simply melted into the forest. 2 weeks after the incident, Liam received a call from a detective working the case. 2 hikers had gone missing in that same national park the previous year, a young couple in their 20s. They had been camping at a backcountry site, much like Liam and Sarah. Their tent and gear were found untouched, but they were never seen again. The case had gone cold with no leads and no evidence of what happened to them. The detective did not say it directly, but the implication was clear. Liam and Sarah had encountered a predator, someone who stalked the remote places where people go to feel safe and alone. They had survived only because Liam had trusted his instincts and refused to leave the tent. Others had not been so fortunate. Liam never camped in that park again. In fact, he rarely camped anywhere anymore. The wilderness had lost its appeal, tainted by the memory of that voice in the darkness and the shadow that stood watch over their tent through those terrible hours. Sometimes, late at night, he still heard that flat, mechanical voice demanding he open the tent. And he wondered how many others had heard the same voice, in how many other remote places, and how many of them had made the fatal mistake of believing it was really a ranger. Noah had never been particularly superstitious. He approached life with a practical mindset shaped by his engineering degree and a general skepticism toward anything that could not be measured or explained. So when his 3 college friends proposed a camping trip to the Appalachian Mountains near the ruins of an old mining settlement, his concerns were purely practical. Would the trails be maintained? Was the weather forecast favorable? Did they have adequate supplies? The possibility of encountering something supernatural never crossed his mind. The trip was Marcus's idea. He had stumbled across references to an abandoned mining town called Harwick while researching local history for a photography project. The town had thrived briefly in the 1880s, supporting nearly 300 people who worked the coal seams running through the mountains. But a catastrophic mine collapse in 1887 had killed 14 men, and the town never recovered. Within 5 years, everyone had moved away, leaving the site to slowly decay back into the forest. Marcus was fascinated by the idea of photographing the ruins, and he convinced Noah, Tyler, and Brandon that it would make for an interesting weekend adventure. They drove up on a Friday evening in early November, the mountains already showing the bare bones of winter. The leaves had fallen, leaving the trees skeletal against a gray sky. They stopped at a small tavern in the nearest town to grab dinner before heading to the trailhead. The place was typical of rural mountain establishments. Dark wood paneling, a scarred bar, local men nursing beers and watching a football game on an outdated television. The bartender was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and hands weathered by decades of hard work. When Marcus mentioned where they were headed, her expression changed. She set down the glass she had been wiping and looked at each of them in turn. "You boys know about that place?" she asked, her Appalachian accent thick and deliberate. Marcus smiled, assuming she was about to share some local folklore. "We know it is an old mining town. We are just going to camp nearby and check out the ruins." The woman did not smile back. "That land is watched over. People who go there feel unwelcome. Some hear things, some see things. I would recommend you find somewhere else to spend your weekend." Tyler laughed it off, thanking her for the warning, but insisting they would be fine. The woman shrugged and went back to her work. But Noah noticed she kept glancing at them with an expression somewhere between pity and resignation, as if she had seen this scene play out before and knew how it ended. They reached the trailhead just before dark and hiked the 2 miles to the site by flashlight. The ruins were more extensive than Noah had expected. Foundations of buildings jutted from the forest floor like broken teeth. Rusted machinery parts lay half buried in decades of leaf litter. A few structures still had partial walls standing, though the roofs had long since collapsed. In the dim beam of their flashlights, the place looked eerie but not threatening. Just sad. A testament to ambition and tragedy. They set up camp in a clearing about 50 yards from the main cluster of ruins, near where the mining office had once stood. A historical marker, weathered and barely legible, provided some basic facts about the settlement. Noah read it while the others pitched tents. 14 men killed in the collapse. Bodies never recovered due to unstable conditions. Mines sealed permanently. The usual grim footnote of industrial history. They built a fire and settled in for the evening, passing around a flask of whiskey and talking about classes, relationships, and plans for after graduation. The conversation was easy and familiar. The kind of aimless talk that comes naturally among old friends. Marcus took some long exposure shots of the ruins by firelight, pleased with the atmospheric results. By midnight, they were all ready for sleep. Noah crawled into the tent he shared with Tyler, grateful for his warm sleeping bag as the temperature continued to drop. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive and hike. He woke suddenly at 3:17 in the morning, according to his phone. Something had pulled him from sleep, though he could not immediately identify what. He lay still, listening. Tyler was snoring softly beside him. Outside, the fire had died to nothing. The forest was absolutely silent. Then he saw the figure. It was standing at the very edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet from the tent. Barely visible in the faint moonlight that filtered through the bare branches, it appeared to be a man. Tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like old work clothes. The figure was completely motionless, facing toward the tents. Noah's first thought was that one of the others had gotten up to relieve themselves. But the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, and standing in a posture that seemed unnatural. No one stood that still, especially not in the cold. He watched the figure for several seconds, his rational mind trying to supply an explanation. A tree stump that looked like a person in the darkness. A trick of shadows and moonlight. But even as he considered these possibilities, he knew they were wrong. This was not a natural formation. It was something standing there, watching them. Noah reached for his flashlight, moving slowly so as not to wake Tyler. His fingers had just closed around it when the figure moved. Not walked, but shifted position instantaneously, like a film with frames cut out. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing. The next moment it was 10 feet closer. Noah's breath caught in his throat. That was not possible. Nothing moved like that. He blinked hard, wondering if he was still asleep, caught in some vivid dream. But when he opened his eyes, the figure was closer still, now less than 20 feet from the tent. He had seen it move. It had simply appeared in a new location, as if teleporting across the clearing. Terror flooded through him, primal and overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, unable to move or even cry out. The figure stood there, and though he could not make out any features in the darkness, he had the absolute certainty that it was staring directly at him. Noah squeezed his eyes shut, counting to 5, willing this to be a dream. When he opened them, the figure was gone. He sat up so fast, he hit his head on the tent's roof, gasping. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the flashlight, finally getting it turned on. He swept the beam across the clearing, illuminating trees, dead grass, scattered leaves. Nothing else. He was about to convince himself it had been a hallucination, some product of an exhausted mind, when his flashlight died. Not a gradual dimming as batteries failed, but an instant death, as if someone had flipped a switch. He shook it frantically, but it remained dark. Then he heard the whispers. They came from all around the tent, not words exactly, but sounds that suggested language. Low and urgent, like multiple people having a conversation just below the threshold of comprehension. The voices were masculine, rough, speaking in rhythm but with no discernible meaning. The sound raised goosebumps across Noah's entire body. "Tyler?" he hissed, reaching over to shake his friend. "Tyler, wake up." Tyler groaned and rolled over. "What? Do you hear that?" Tyler was silent for a moment, listening. "Hear what?" "The voices, the whispering." "I do not hear anything, man. Go back to sleep." But Noah could hear them clearly, surrounding the tent, moving in a circle. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. And then he saw the fire. Through the mesh window of the tent, he could see the dead campfire pit. Except it was no longer dead. Flames roared up from it, easily 3 feet high, burning with an unnatural blue-white light that cast dancing shadows across the clearing. The fire made no sound. It simply burned impossibly, fed by nothing but the ashes they had left hours before. "Tyler!" Noah grabbed his friend's arm. "Look at the fire!" Tyler sat up, following Noah's pointing finger. His eyes went wide as he saw the flames. What the hell? The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse. Complete silence. Not even the wind moved. The blue flames continued their silent dance, illuminating the clearing in ghostly light. And in that light, Noah saw that they were not alone. Figures stood in a circle around the fire. 7 or 8 of them, maybe more, all wearing the same rough work clothes, all impossibly thin, all standing in that same unnatural stillness. Their faces were in shadow, but Noah could feel their attention, focused entirely on the tents. In the tent beside theirs, Marcus and Brandon were awake now too, their voices raised in confusion and fear. All 4 of them saw the same thing, the impossible fire and the silent watchers surrounding it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fire roared even higher, a pillar of blue flame reaching toward the sky. The heat should have been unbearable at that distance, but Noah felt nothing. The figures remained motionless around the inferno, and for just a moment, Noah thought he could see their faces in the blue light. Hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams, expressions of rage and sorrow mixed together. Brandon screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of pure terror. The moment the scream echoed across the clearing, the fire vanished. Not died down, but vanished completely, as if it had never existed. The figures were gone. The clearing was dark and empty again. All four of them erupted from their tents simultaneously, stumbling into each other in the darkness, all talking at once, all confirming they had seen the same impossible thing. Marcus tried his flashlight, which worked perfectly. The fire pit contained only cold ashes. But when they examined the ground around the fire, they found something that made Noah's blood run cold. The tent stakes had been pulled up, not by wind or animals, but deliberately removed and placed in a perfect circle around the fire pit, evenly spaced, driven into the ground in a pattern that could not have been accidental. None of them had done this. They had all been in their tents. Their food bags, hung carefully from a tree branch to avoid attracting bears, had been taken down and emptied. The contents were scattered across the clearing in what might have been random chaos. But Noah noticed that nothing had been eaten. The food was simply distributed, as if someone had been searching through it and then discarded everything. They stood in a tight group in the center of the clearing, playing their flashlights in every direction, seeing nothing but feeling watched by hostile presences just beyond the reach of the light. None of them suggested staying until morning. Without discussion, they began breaking down their camp with frantic speed, stuffing gear into packs without any attempt at organization, wanting only to get away from that place. They were on the trail within 20 minutes, hiking by flashlight, stumbling over roots and rocks in their haste, but not caring. The 2 miles back to the parking area felt like 10. Every sound in the dark forest made them jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a watching figure. When they finally reached the cars and the comforting presence of the paved parking area, they sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what they had experienced. As the adrenaline began to fade, Marcus pulled out his phone and started searching for information about the mining disaster. What he found confirmed their worst fears. The collapse had occurred on November 3rd, 1887. 14 men had been working deep in the mine when a support timber failed, triggering a cascading collapse that sealed them in. Rescue efforts lasted 4 days, but the instability of the remaining structure made it impossible to reach the trapped miners. On the 4th day, another collapse killed 2 would-be rescuers, and the operation was abandoned. The 14 men were left where they died, their bodies still entombed in the mountain. Marcus looked up from his phone, his face pale. "Guys, today is November 3rd. The coincidence was too exact to ignore. They had camped on the anniversary of the disaster, on the ground where those 14 men had lived and worked, and they had been visited by something that wanted them gone. Further research over the following days revealed more. The mining settlement had a reputation among locals. People who camped near the ruins reported feeling unwelcome, experiencing unexplained phenomena, and sometimes fleeing in the middle of the night. There were stories going back decades of mysterious fires, whispered voices, and thin figures seen standing among the ruins. The common thread in all the accounts was rage, a palpable anger directed at anyone who intruded on that space. The historical records provided a possible explanation. The miners who died had been recent immigrants, mostly from Eastern Europe, lured to America with promises of good wages and steady work. They had left families behind, planning to send for them once they were established. When they died, their bodies were never sent home, never given proper burials according to their traditions. They were simply sealed in the mountain and forgotten as the town emptied out and nature reclaimed the site. Noah found himself wondering if the bartender's warning about the land being watched over was more accurate than she knew. Perhaps those 14 men, or whatever remained of their consciousness, still walked the ruins of Harwick. Perhaps they resented the intrusion of strangers into the place of their death, especially on the anniversary of their tragedy. He never returned to those mountains. None of them did. Tyler changed schools the following semester, wanting to put distance between himself and the experience. Marcus deleted all the photos from that night and stopped his local history project. Brandon started seeing a therapist to deal with nightmares that persisted for months. Noah still thinks about that night, about the impossible fire and the figures standing in silent vigil around it. He had been a skeptic, someone who demanded rational explanations for every phenomenon. But there is no rational explanation for what they experienced. Something was in that clearing with them, something that defied every natural law he understood. He does not talk about it much anymore. When he does, people assume he is embellishing, turning a scary camping trip into a ghost story. But he knows what he saw. He knows what they all saw. And he knows that some places are marked by tragedy so deep that it echoes across generations, refusing to be forgotten, demanding recognition from anyone foolish enough to intrude on ground that has been consecrated by blood and suffering. The mountains of Appalachia hold many secrets, and some of those secrets do not want to be disturbed. Ethan needed to get away from everything. The breakup with Amanda had been brutal, the kind that leaves you questioning every decision you made over the past 3 years. He could not stand being in the apartment they had shared, surrounded by reminders of what had fallen apart. His friends meant well with their offers to go out drinking or their attempts at distraction, but Ethan needed something different. He needed silence, solitude, and the clarity that only nature could provide. He chose the Pacific Northwest specifically because of its reputation for old-growth forests. He wanted to be surrounded by something ancient, something that existed long before his problems and would continue long after. He researched for days before settling on a remote area in the Olympic Peninsula, a region known for massive Douglas firs and limited human traffic. The forecast showed clear weather for the weekend, and Ethan loaded his truck with camping gear on a Friday afternoon in late October. The drive took longer than expected, the roads narrowing progressively until he found himself on a gravel logging road that barely qualified as a road at all. His truck bounced over ruts and rocks for nearly an hour before he reached the trailhead, which consisted of nothing more than a small clearing where the road ended. There were no other vehicles, no signs indicating trail names or distances, just a narrow path disappearing into the massive trees. Ethan shouldered his pack now and started walking. The forest was stunning in its scale. The trees rose like cathedral columns, their trunks wider than he could wrap his arms around, their canopy so dense that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. Ferns grew everywhere in the dim light, creating a lush carpet of green. The air smelled of moss and decay, the rich scent of a living ecosystem. He hiked for nearly 2 hours before finding what he was looking for. A clearing opened beside a clear stream, the water running over smooth stones with a gentle music that immediately soothed his frayed nerves. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across, carpeted with soft grass and surrounded by the towering trees. Sunlight actually reached the ground here, filtered through the canopy in golden shafts that gave the space an almost sacred quality. Ethan dropped his pack and began setting up camp. He was pitching his tent when he noticed the first carving. It was on a massive fir at the edge of the clearing, cut deep into the bark, maybe 5 feet off the ground. The symbol was unfamiliar, a series of intersecting lines forming a pattern that looked almost like a stylized eye. Ethan walked closer, running his fingers over the carving. It was not fresh, but it was not ancient either. The exposed wood had weathered, but not yet grayed completely. He estimated it was perhaps a year or two old. Curious, he walked the perimeter of the clearing and found more symbols. They were on different trees, all at roughly the same height, all carved with similar depth and precision. Some matched the first eye-like symbol. Others were different, more abstract patterns that might have been letters in some alphabet he did not recognize. Together, they seemed to form a rough circle around the clearing. Ethan felt a small chill of unease, but dismissed it. Probably some local kids or maybe hikers who fancied themselves amateur pagans. People carved all kinds of things in remote places. It did not mean anything. He finished setting up camp and spent the remainder of the afternoon trying to read. But his mind kept drifting back to Amanda and the increasingly bitter final months of their relationship. As darkness fell, he cooked a simple meal over his camp stove and watched the stars emerge through breaks in the canopy. Around 10 o'clock, he heard the drumming. It was distant at first, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to come from deeper in the forest. Ethan sat up from where he had been lying by his fire, listening intently. The rhythm was steady, multiple drums playing in coordination. And there were voices too, faint but audible, rising and falling in what sounded like a chant. His first thought was that there must be another camping group nearby, though he had seen no evidence of other people, and the sound seemed to be coming from quite a distance. He listened for several minutes as the drumming continued. It was growing gradually louder, or perhaps closer. The chanting became more distinct, though he could not make out any words. Then he saw the lights. They appeared between the trees, bobbing and weaving like lanterns carried by people walking in procession. Ethan stood, his heart beginning to beat faster. The lights were approaching the clearing, following what must have been a trail he had not noticed. The drumming was loud now, clearly audible over the sound of the stream. He watched, frozen in place, as the procession emerged into his clearing. There were perhaps 15 people, moving in a single file line. Each wore a mask, carved wooden faces representing various animals. He recognized a bear, a wolf, an owl, and others he could not immediately identify. The masks were crude but striking, painted in earth tones and adorned with feathers and fur. The people wore long cloaks made of what looked like burlap or rough wool, hooded and shapeless. Several carried drums, beating out that hypnotic rhythm. Others held torches, the flames casting wild shadows across the clearing. They moved as if Ethan was not there. The procession entered the clearing and began to form a circle, the participants arranging themselves with practiced precision. They were chanting in unison now, words in a language Ethan did not recognize. It might have been Native American, though it did not quite sound like any indigenous language he had heard before. There was something older about it, more guttural. Ethan stood beside his tent, less than 20 feet from the circle, completely visible in the firelight. But none of them looked at him. They continued their ritual, focused entirely on whatever ceremony they were performing. One figure stepped into the center of the circle. This person wore a stag mask, more elaborate than the others, with real antlers attached to the wooden face. The stag-masked figure held something in both hands, lifting it toward the sky. Ethan could see it was a dead crow, arranged with flowers and what might have been herbs. The chanting reached a crescendo. The stag-masked figure placed the crow carefully on the ground in the exact center of the circle. The others began to move around it, dancing in a slow rotation while maintaining their chant. The drumming changed tempo, becoming faster, more urgent. Ethan knew he should feel scared, but the emotion that dominated was confusion. This was clearly some kind of ritual, performed with serious intent. But why here? Why on this specific night? And why were they acting as if his presence was completely irrelevant? The dance continued for several minutes. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The chanting ceased. The drums fell silent. Every masked figure stood perfectly still in the sudden quiet. The stag-masked leader turned and looked directly at Ethan. Even through the wooden mask, even with the eye holes showing nothing but shadow, Ethan felt the weight of that gaze. It was not curiosity or surprise. It was something else, something that made his blood run cold. Recognition, perhaps, or judgment. The stag-masked figure raised one arm and pointed directly at him. The others turned in unison, all of their animal faces now oriented toward Ethan. No one spoke. No one moved except to maintain that pointing gesture. 15 arms extended toward where he stood beside his tent. Terror finally broke through Ethan's paralysis. He did not grab his gear or his food or anything except his phone and keys from the tent. He ran. He crashed into the forest, no longer on any trail, just running in what he hoped was the general direction of his truck. Branches whipped at his face. He stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind him, he heard nothing. No pursuit, no shouts, just the terrible silence of those masked figures. He ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. Several times he fell, picking himself up and continuing without pause. Terror gave him strength beyond what he knew he possessed. When he finally stumbled onto the logging road, he nearly collapsed with relief. His truck was still there, untouched. He fumbled with his keys, got the door open, and locked himself inside. Only then did he allow himself to look back toward the forest. The trees stood dark and silent. No lights, no sounds. Nothing to indicate anyone else was out there. Ethan started the truck and drove, not caring about the rough road, bouncing violently over ruts he had navigated carefully on the way in. He did not slow down until he reached paved highway. 30 minutes later, he spent the rest of the night in a motel room, doors locked, curtains drawn. When morning came, he called the county sheriff and reported what he had seen. The deputy who took his statement was polite but skeptical. There were no organized groups known to perform ceremonies in that area. No permits had been issued for gatherings. When Ethan insisted, the deputy promised to send someone to check the site. 3 days later, Ethan received a call. Rangers had hiked to the clearing he described. They found his tent, his gear, everything exactly as he had left it. But there was no evidence of any other people. No trampled grass where a circle had formed. No remains of the dead crow, no footprints other than his own. However, they did find something that made Ethan's hands shake when they described it. The symbols he had seen carved into the trees had been burned into the ground. Not carved, not painted, but burned deep into the earth in a perfect circle where his tent had stood. The grass inside the circle was completely dead, as if the ground itself had been poisoned. The Rangers had no explanation. They confiscated his gear as evidence in an ongoing investigation, though Ethan never learned what they were investigating or what conclusions they reached. He researched the area obsessively for weeks after, looking for any reference to rituals or ceremonies or groups that might wear animal masks. He found mentions in obscure forums of the old ceremonies, practices that supposedly predated European contact, kept alive by families who never abandoned the traditions even as the world modernized around them. Some posts suggested these groups were protective of certain places, performing rituals to maintain spiritual boundaries. Whether that was true or just internet folklore, Ethan never learned. What he knew with certainty was that he had intruded on something he was never meant to witness, and those masked figures had marked him in some way. The burned circle where his tent had stood felt like a warning or perhaps a curse. He never went solo camping again. Some clearings, no matter how beautiful, are reserved for purposes beyond the understanding of those who do not belong there. Mason had been backpacking for nearly 15 years, accumulating enough experience to feel confident in even the most remote wilderness areas. He prided himself on thorough preparation, physical fitness, and the kind of calm judgment that kept people safe in environments where mistakes could be fatal. When he decided to spend a long weekend exploring the slot canyons of southern Utah, he approached it with his usual methodical planning. He researched routes, checked weather forecasts, packed appropriate gear, and filed a detailed itinerary with his roommate. Everything was done properly, by the book. The canyon he chose was called Serpent's Throat, a narrow passage carved through red sandstone over millions of years by water that now appeared only during flash floods. It was not on the standard tourist circuit. Access required hiking several miles across exposed desert, followed by a technical descent into the canyon system. According to the hiking forums Mason consulted, fewer than 100 people visited Serpent's Throat each year. That isolation was exactly what appealed to him. He arrived at the trailhead on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September. The temperature was still brutal, the kind of dry heat that sucked moisture from exposed skin within minutes. Mason started the approach hike in the late afternoon, planning to reach the canyon entrance around sunset, when the temperatures would become more manageable. The desert landscape was stark and beautiful, all red rock and sparse vegetation under an impossibly blue sky. The descent into the canyon required careful navigation down a series of natural ledges, and one section where he used a rope he had anchored at the rim. Once inside the canyon system, the temperature dropped noticeably. The walls rose perhaps 80 feet on either side, so narrow in places that Mason could touch both walls simultaneously. The rock was striated in shades of red and orange, polished smooth by ancient floods. The acoustics were remarkable. Every footstep echoed, every breath seemed amplified. Mason hiked deeper into the canyon as twilight turned to darkness overhead. He used his headlamp to navigate, though the canyon was so narrow that he could only move forward or backward. There were no side passages here, no places to get genuinely lost. That simplicity was part of the appeal. He found his intended campsite about 2 miles into the canyon. The passage widened slightly here, creating a space perhaps 15 feet across. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the walls, geometric patterns and animal figures pecked into the rock by people who had occupied this landscape centuries before Europeans arrived. Mason had researched these carvings specifically. They were ancestral Puebloan, probably created between 800 and 1200 years ago. He set up his sleeping pad and bag on the sandy canyon floor, ate a cold dinner, and settled in to read by headlamp. The silence was profound. No wind reached the canyon floor. No animals seemed to live in this harsh environment. Just Mason and the ancient rock and the vastness of the desert night above. Around 10 o'clock, he heard his name. Mason. The voice was his own. Same tone, same inflection, but he had not spoken. He sat up quickly, shining his headlamp down the canyon in the direction the sound had come from. The beam illuminated only empty passage, the walls narrowing into shadow perhaps 30 feet away. He listened intently. Nothing. Perhaps it had been an auditory hallucination, his tired mind playing tricks. Or maybe an echo of some sound he had made without realizing it, reflected strangely by the canyon walls. Then it came again. Mason. Closer this time. And there was no question now. It was his voice calling his name from deeper in the canyon. The same voice he heard recorded on videos, the voice he had never quite gotten used to hearing played back, because it sounded different from how he heard it inside his own head. He stood up, heart beginning to race. Hello? His greeting echoed naturally, bouncing off the walls in a diminishing series. but there was no answer from whatever had called his name. Mason considered his options. He could pack up and attempt to retreat back to the canyon entrance in the darkness. Or he could investigate, try to determine what was making the sound. His rational mind insisted there must be an explanation. Perhaps another hiker was in the canyon, someone with a similar voice. Perhaps there was some bizarre acoustic phenomenon he did not understand. He grabbed his headlamp and started walking deeper into Serpent's Throat. The canyon narrowed further, the walls closing in until he had to turn sideways in places to squeeze through. His headlamp beam showed only rock and more rock, passage stretching ahead with no sign of any other person. He called out several more times, and each time his voice echoed normally with no response. Then he saw the camp. It was set up in a small widening of the canyon, perhaps a quarter-mile beyond where Mason had established his own site. A sleeping bag, a backpack, scattered items of gear, a water bottle sitting upright on a flat rock. Everything looked recent, not abandoned for days or weeks, but actively in use. Mason approached cautiously. "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. He knelt beside the backpack, shining his light on it. The pack was a Gregory model, forest green, well used but maintained. Attached to it was a small journal, the kind backpackers often carried to record their routes and observations. Mason opened the journal, feeling only slightly guilty about invading someone's privacy. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dated entries describing a solo backpacking trip through the Utah canyons. He flipped to the most recent entry and felt his blood turn to ice. The entry was dated today, September 19th, and the writer's name, written at the top of the page, was MC Mason Carter, his name. He flipped back through the journal with shaking hands. The entries described the exact trip he was on. Same arrival date, same approach hike, same descent into Serpent's Throat. The observations matched perfectly. A description of the petroglyphs. Notes about the temperature differential between the desert rim and the canyon floor. Even a comment about how the acoustics made every sound echo strangely. But these entries were dated 3 weeks earlier, August 29th through September 1st. The final entry was short. "I hear myself calling. I am going to see who it is." Mason dropped the journal as if it had burned him. He backed away from the campsite, his mind reeling. This was not possible. This violated every natural law he understood. But the evidence was there in his hands, written in handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to his own. He turned to retreat to his camp and found it was gone. The canyon section where he knew he had set up his sleeping bag was empty. He ran to the spot, playing his headlamp across the sand. No sleeping bag, no pad, no pack. Everything had vanished. But there were footprints in the sand, multiple overlapping tracks from boots that looked exactly like the ones he was wearing. Mason spun in a circle, breathing hard, trying to understand what was happening. Then he saw his pack. It was sitting against the canyon wall, exactly where the other pack had been in the camp he had just found. He approached it slowly and saw the journal attached to it. His journal, the one he carried on every backpacking trip. With trembling hands, he opened it to the last entry. His own handwriting filled the page. The entry was dated September 1st, 3 weeks ago. It described his trip, including a note about hearing his own voice calling from deeper in the canyon. The final line read, "I found another camp. Same gear, same pack. Journal dated 6 months earlier. What is this place?" Mason turned the page. The next entry was in the same handwriting, but different ink, as if written with a different pen. It was dated 6 months earlier, March 15th. It described the same trip, same canyon, same experience of hearing one's own voice, same discovery of a previous camp. He flipped forward through the journal. There were more entries, dozens of them, all in the same handwriting, stretching back over what appeared to be years. Each one described the same trip. Each one ended with the discovery of an earlier camp. Each one expressed growing confusion and fear. The most recent entry, dated today, September 19th, was only one sentence. The canyon is a loop. Time here folds back on itself. I think I have been here before. I think I will always be here. Mason felt his sanity beginning to crack. He looked up at the narrow strip of night sky visible between the canyon walls. The stars looked wrong somehow, their position subtly off from what they should be. Or perhaps his perception had shifted. Perhaps he was no longer occupying the same moment he thought he was. He ran, not deeper into the canyon and not back toward the entrance, but laterally, scrambling up the canyon wall in a desperate attempt to escape the passage floor. The sandstone was too smooth, too steep. He fell twice, skinning his hands and knees. On the third attempt, he managed to climb perhaps 20 feet before the handholds disappeared and he was forced to descend. When he returned to the canyon floor, he found himself at another camp. This one had his gear, but the arrangement was different. The sleeping bag was unrolled, the pack was open, and sitting on a flat rock was a water bottle he recognized as his own, positioned exactly as it had been in the first camp he had found. He checked the journal again. Now it had more entries, extending further into what appeared to be the future. September 20th, September 21st, each one describing attempts to escape the canyon. Each one failing, each one ending with the same realization that the passage was a closed loop, a place where time did not flow linearly, but circled back on itself endlessly. Mason never made it out of Serpent's Throat Canyon. When rangers found his camp 6 weeks later, alerted by his roommate after he failed to return as scheduled, his gear was arranged in a neat pile. His journal was open to a page dated 2 years in the future, filled with handwriting that matched the earlier entries but had degraded into barely legible scrawl. The final entry was just one word repeated dozens of times. Echoes. The canyon has been unofficially closed since then. Not by any official decree, but by quiet recommendation from rangers who know its reputation. 7 hikers have vanished in Serpent's Throat since 1970. Their gear is always found, arranged with eerie precision. Journals open to entries describing trips that occurred weeks or months before their actual arrival dates. Indigenous groups who have lived near the canyon for generations say it is a place where time folds, where the past and future exist simultaneously. They avoid it, considering the passage sacred and dangerous in equal measure. They say some places exist outside the normal flow of reality, and that people who enter such places may find themselves trapped in moments that repeat infinitely, forever searching for an exit that exists always just ahead and always just behind, never quite reachable, never quite real. Lucas had been struggling with writer's block for nearly 6 months. His debut novel had done moderately well enough to secure a 2-book contract with his publisher. But the second book refused to materialize. He would sit at his laptop for hours, staring at a blank screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at him. His editor was patient but persistent, and the deadline was approaching with terrifying speed. Lucas needed a change of environment, something drastic enough to shake loose whatever was blocking his creative process. He found the cabin listing on a remote rental website. It was located on a small lake in the Canadian wilderness, accessible only by boat, with no neighbors for miles. The listing emphasized complete isolation. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. Just a well-maintained cabin with a wood stove, propane lighting, and stunning views. The owner offered discounted rates for extended stays. Lucas booked it for 2 weeks, without hesitation. The float plane that took him to the cabin was a tiny four-seater piloted by a weathered man in his 60s who made small talk about fishing and weather patterns. He dropped Lucas at a wooden dock that extended from the cabin's rocky shoreline, helped unload his supplies, and handed him a satellite phone for emergencies. "You got enough food for 2 weeks?" the pilot asked, eyeing Lucas's collection of boxes and bags. "More than enough," Lucas confirmed. "Good. I will be back on the 23rd unless you call sooner. Weather permitting, of course." The pilot paused, looking at the cabin and then back at Lucas. "You staying here alone?" "That is the plan." The pilot nodded slowly. "Some folks find it gets too quiet after a few days. The isolation can mess with your head if you are not used to it. You got that sat phone. Do not be shy about using it if you need out early." Lucas thanked him and watched the plane taxi across the glassy water before lifting off and disappearing over the tree line. The silence that followed was profound. No traffic, no voices, no background hum of modern life. Just water lapping against the dock and wind moving through the pines. The cabin was exactly as advertised. One large room with a sleeping area, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a desk positioned by a window overlooking the lake. The walls were decorated with mounted fish and old photographs of previous visitors holding impressive catches. Lucas unpacked his supplies, set up his laptop, and made himself dinner as the sun set behind the western ridge. That first night, he slept deeply and woke feeling more refreshed than he had in months. He spent the morning exploring the immediate area around the cabin, then settled at the desk after lunch to write. The words came easily, flowing in a way they had not in half a year. By evening, he had produced nearly 3,000 words of usable material. He felt elated. The pattern continued for 4 days. Wake, write, eat, explore, write more, sleep. Lucas fell into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. He fished from the dock in the late afternoons, catching enough trout for dinner. He watched loons diving in the lake's center. He sat by the wood stove in the evenings, reading by lamplight and feeling content in a way he had forgotten was possible. On the 5th morning, he woke to find his canoe had been moved. He knew he had pulled it fully onto the rocky beach the previous evening, securing it well above the waterline. But now it sat at the water's edge, turned upside down as if someone had intentionally flipped it. Lucas walked around the canoe slowly, looking for signs of animal activity or some natural explanation. The beach showed no tracks other than his own footprints from the previous day. He flipped the canoe back over and returned it to its proper position, dismissing the incident as something he must have misremembered. Perhaps he had not secured it as well as he thought. The wind might have caught it somehow. But over the next few days, other things began to happen. He would wake to find his coffee mug on a different counter than where he had left it the night before. The wood stove poker would be leaning against the opposite wall. Pages of his manuscript would be rearranged on the desk, shuffled into a different order than he had left them. Each incident was small, easy to rationalize as his own forgetfulness. He was alone in the wilderness, after all, with no routine and no external structure. Perhaps he was simply becoming absent-minded. On day 8, Lucas decided to test his theory. Before going to bed, he arranged items in very specific positions. He placed his coffee mug in the exact center of the kitchen table. He stacked 3 books on the desk in a precise order and photographed them with his phone. He positioned the canoe paddle across the doorway at an angle, balancing it carefully so it would fall if the door opened. He woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of the paddle clattering to the floor. Lucas sat up in bed, heart racing, peering into the darkness of the cabin. The paddle lay on the floor. The door was closed. He turned on his headlamp and checked the room. The coffee mug was now sitting on the counter beside the sink. The 3 books had been rearranged in reverse order. He was alone. Every door and window was closed and latched from the inside. There was no one else in the cabin, yet someone or something had moved these objects while he slept. Lucas barely slept the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, he checked the photographs on his phone to confirm he had not dreamed the arrangement of items. The photos showed exactly what he remembered. Someone was moving things, but who and how? He spent the day watching the cabin nervously, but nothing happened during daylight hours. That evening, he set up his phone to record video overnight, positioning it on a shelf with a view of most of the room. He went to bed tense and alert, lying awake for hours before exhaustion finally pulled him under. He woke at sunrise and immediately checked the phone. The video had recorded 8 hours of footage. Lucas fast-forwarded through most of it, watching the empty room remain empty. Then, at the 3-hour mark, something happened. A figure rose from his bed. It took Lucas a moment to realize he was looking at himself. The video showed him getting up, walking mechanically to the kitchen, moving the coffee mug, walking to the desk, rearranging papers, then returning to bed. His movements were stiff and unnatural, like a sleepwalker or someone being remotely controlled. His face, when it briefly turned toward the camera, was completely blank. No expression, no awareness. Just empty features. Lucas watched the video 3 more times, his hands shaking. He had no memory of any of this. None. He had been deeply asleep, or so he thought. Yet here was proof that he had been moving around the cabin, rearranging things, doing it all while apparently unconscious. That night, he forced himself to watch the video recording again. This time, he noticed something even more disturbing. At one point, his sleepwalking self stopped in front of the camera and stood there for nearly 5 minutes, staring directly into the lens. The expression on his face was not quite blank anymore. There was something behind the eyes, some presence that was not quite him. Over the next 3 nights, the pattern continued. Each night, the video showed him rising at approximately 3 in the morning, moving through the cabin, rearranging objects, sometimes sitting at the desk and typing on his laptop. He checked what had been typed and found pages of text he did not remember writing. The content was disturbing, descriptions of events at the lake that had not happened yet, but were written as if they already had. A drowning, a disappearance, a body found on the rocky shore. On day 12, Lucas decided he had to search the cabin thoroughly. He pulled out drawers, looked behind furniture, checked under the floorboards. In a hidden compartment built into the wall behind a mounted fish, he found a stack of journals. They were written by previous renters of the cabin, spanning what appeared to be several years. Lucas read through them with growing horror. Every person described the same experience. Items moving during the night, a feeling of being watched, and eventually, the discovery that they were getting up and moving around while apparently asleep. One journal entry, dated 5 years earlier, stood out. The lake does not want anyone to leave. It gets into your head somehow, makes you do things. I tried to pack up and go today, but found myself unpacking everything an hour later with no memory of doing it. Called for early pickup, but then called back and canceled. I do not remember making that second call. I need help. The journal ended there. Lucas checked the name written inside the front cover and searched for it on his phone. The signal was weak, but functional enough for a basic search. He found an obituary. The man had drowned in a Canadian lake 6 weeks after that final journal entry. The death was ruled accidental. Lucas found similar patterns in other journals. People staying too long, people acting strangely. Some of the journals ended with entries dated weeks after the person had supposedly left. One journal contained entries extending 2 months beyond the writer's planned departure date, becoming increasingly incoherent, the handwriting degrading into barely legible scrawl. That night, Lucas did not sleep. He sat in a chair facing the door, holding the satellite phone, watching the clock. At 3 in the morning exactly, he felt it. A pressure in his head, gentle but insistent, suggesting he stand up, walk to the bed, lie down, sleep. He fought it, gripping the arms of the chair, forcing himself to stay alert. The pressure increased, becoming painful, his vision blurred. He raised the sat phone and pressed the emergency button before the darkness took him. He woke on the dock in the morning sunlight, his feet in the water, no memory of how he had gotten there. The satellite phone was gone. The float plane arrived that afternoon, summoned by his emergency call. The pilot found Lucas sitting on the dock, staring at the water, clutching his manuscript. On the flight back, Lucas reviewed what he had written during his stay. The novel was complete, every chapter finished, including sections he had no memory of writing. The quality was excellent, perhaps the best work he had ever produced. But the final chapters described events he had not experienced. Scenes set at the lake involving a character very much like himself, slowly losing his grip on reality, becoming part of the lake itself. His consciousness absorbed into something ancient that lived in the water and the forest and the cabin. Lucas burned the manuscript the day he got home. He never published the second novel. He never wrote again. Some stories, he decided, are not meant to be told, and some places extract a price for their inspiration that is far too high to pay. Jack had been looking forward to the camping trip for weeks. His younger brother Danny was 13, at that awkward age where he was trying to act older than he was, desperate to be treated like an adult rather than a kid. Their parents had split up the previous year, and Jack, now 22 and working his first real job, wanted to do something to maintain their relationship. A weekend camping trip seemed perfect. Low pressure, time to talk or not talk as they chose, and a chance to get away from the constant tension that still lingered whenever they visited their mother's house. They chose a state park campground about 2 hours from home. It was popular enough to feel safe, with rangers patrolling regularly and families scattered throughout the loops of campsites. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in mid-July, the peak of camping season. The campground was nearly full, RVs and tents occupying most of the numbered sites. Kids rode bikes along the paved roads. The smell of grilling meat drifted from multiple directions. It was exactly the wholesome family atmosphere Jack had hoped for. They set up their tent at Site 47, a spot with decent tree cover and close proximity to the bathrooms. That proximity seemed like a convenience at first. Danny could walk to the restrooms without Jack worrying about him getting lost in the dark. It was only 100 yards or so, easily visible from their campsite. After setting up, they explored the area. The campground had a small beach on a lake, a playground, and several hiking trails. They swam for an hour, the cold water a relief from the July heat, then returned to their site to start dinner. Jack grilled hot dogs while Danny attempted to build a campfire using techniques he had learned from YouTube videos. It was a good evening, comfortable and easy in a way their interactions had not been since the divorce. As darkness fell, they sat by the fire and Danny talked about school, his friends, a girl he maybe liked but was not sure about. Jack listened and offered what he hoped was decent advice, feeling oddly adult and responsible. Around 10 o'clock, Danny announced he needed to use the bathroom. Jack watched him walk down the gravel path toward the brick building that housed the restrooms, his brother's silhouette visible in the glow of the campground's sparse lighting. That was when Jack noticed the man. He was sitting in a folding chair at the campsite directly adjacent to theirs, Site 48. Jack had not paid much attention to the site earlier. There had been a sedan parked there, nothing remarkable, no tent visible. Now he saw the man clearly, illuminated by a small, battery-powered lantern. He was middle-aged, perhaps 50, wearing khaki cargo shorts and a faded t-shirt. He had no book, no phone, no apparent activity. He was simply sitting in his chair, facing toward the bathroom building, watching. Jack felt a small stirring of unease, but dismissed it. Maybe the guy was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just relaxing and had happened to face that direction. Still, something about the stillness of the man's posture bothered him. Danny returned from the bathroom, and they talked for another hour before deciding to turn in. As they crawled into the tent, Jack glanced over at Site 48. The man was still sitting there in exactly the same position, still facing the bathrooms. Jack woke sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of Danny unzipping the tent. His brother whispered that he needed to pee again. Jack mumbled acknowledgement and checked his phone. It was 2:30 in the morning. The campground was silent, except for the distant call of an owl and the rustling of something small in the underbrush. Danny left the tent, and Jack lay there in the darkness, too awake now to fall back asleep immediately. He heard Danny's footsteps on the gravel path, moving away from the tent toward the bathrooms. Then he heard other footsteps. They were heavier, more deliberate, following the same path Danny had taken. Jack sat up, suddenly fully alert. He unzipped the tent mesh window and peered out into the darkness. The man from Site 48 was walking toward the bathrooms, following Danny. The same man, still wearing the same clothes, moving with purpose through the darkness. He had no flashlight, but the campground's security lights provided enough illumination to see by. Jack's protective instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of the tent, not bothering with shoes. He followed the man, keeping a distance of perhaps 50 feet. The man reached the bathroom building and stopped outside, not entering, just standing near the entrance in the shadows, where the security light did not quite reach. Jack approached quickly, making no attempt to be quiet. The man heard him coming and turned, his face neutral in the dim light. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice harder than he intended. "Just using the facilities," the man replied. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Then why are you standing out here?" "Waiting my turn." The man's eyes flicked toward the bathroom entrance, then back to Jack. Jack positioned himself between the man and the door. "My brother's in there. I will wait with you." For a long moment, the man said nothing. They stood in uncomfortable silence, at Jack's heart pounding, the man's expression unreadable. Then Danny emerged from the bathroom, looking confused to find Jack standing there. "Everything okay?" Danny asked. "Yeah, just needed some air. Let us head back." Jack kept himself between Danny and the stranger as they walked back to their campsite. He looked back once and saw the man still standing there, not moving, not entering the bathroom, just watching them leave. Jack did not sleep the rest of the night. He sat in the tent entrance, watching Site 48. The man returned to his chair and resumed his vigil, facing the bathrooms. At one point, another child, a boy of maybe 9 or 10 from a nearby campsite, walked to the restrooms alone. The man stood up and began walking in the same direction. But the boy's father appeared moments later, clearly having followed his son. And the stranger stopped, turned around, and returned to his chair. As soon as the sun rose and the ranger station opened, Jack left Danny at the campsite and walked to the main office. He told the ranger on duty everything he had observed, the man's constant watching, the way he had followed Danny, the incident with the other child, the complete lack of camping gear at his site. The ranger's expression grew serious. She radioed for backup, and within minutes, 2 additional rangers arrived. They approached Site 48 together, while Jack watched from a distance. The man was cooperative, but evasive. He claimed he was camping, though he had no tent or visible gear except the chair and lantern. When rangers checked his vehicle, they found restraints, zip ties, and a tarp in the trunk. They also found a notebook containing descriptions of various state park campgrounds, notes about bathroom locations, typical visitor patterns, and times when children were most likely to be alone. The rangers detained him and called local police. Jack gave a full statement. So did the father of the other boy, who confirmed he had noticed the man watching his son and had felt uncomfortable enough to follow him to the bathroom. Police ran the man's information and discovered he was a registered sex offender with convictions related to child exploitation. He had been banned from 3 other state parks in neighboring counties for similar behavior, camping without actual camping equipment and positioning himself near bathroom facilities frequented by children. A detective called Jack 2 days later with an update. The man, whose name was Roger Kessler, was being held on multiple violations of his parole conditions. Further investigation revealed he had been systematically visiting state park campgrounds throughout the region, never staying more than 1 night at each location, always choosing sites near bathrooms, always watching. The detective's voice was grave as he told Jack how close they had come to a tragedy. Kessler had been a suspect in a child abduction case from another state 5 years earlier. A 9-year-old boy had disappeared from a campground bathroom. The child's body was never found. There was no physical evidence linking Kessler to the crime, but the circumstances matched his known patterns perfectly. "You did the right thing," the detective said. "Following your instincts, intervening, reporting it immediately. A lot of people would have talked themselves out of it, worried about seeming paranoid or causing a scene. Your brother is lucky to have you looking out for him." Jack hung up the phone, feeling shaken. He thought about how easily it could have gone differently. If he had not been paying attention, if he had dismissed his unease as paranoia, if Danny had gone to the bathroom alone earlier in the evening when Jack was distracted by setting up camp. The man had been watching, waiting for an opportunity. And Jack had arrived at that campground by pure chance, placing his brother directly in a predator's field of vision. Danny did not fully understand the danger he had been in until Jack explained it carefully, omitting the worst details, but making sure his brother understood why it was important to always be aware of surroundings, to trust his instincts about people who made him uncomfortable, and to never go anywhere isolated alone in public spaces. They never returned to that campground. Jack chose different locations for their subsequent camping trips, always checking the layout of bathroom facilities, always choosing sites where Danny would be visible the entire walk. The innocence of those family campgrounds had been permanently tainted by the knowledge of what could hide in plain sight. Predators who blended seamlessly into the wholesome atmosphere, waiting patiently for children to wander just far enough from safety. The case against Kessler expanded as more evidence was collected. Investigators found digital files on his laptop containing surveillance photos from dozens of campgrounds, images of children taken without their knowledge or their parents' consent. The notebook in his car revealed years of methodical planning, studying the patterns of families, identifying vulnerabilities in campground security, perfecting the appearance of a harmless middle-aged camper who attracted no suspicion. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison on multiple charges. But the detective privately told Jack that they believed Kessler had successfully abducted at least 2 children over the years, though they could not prove it conclusively. Those families would never have closure. Those children were simply gone, vanished from campground bathrooms while their parents sat 100 yards away, believing their children were safe in a supervised public area. Jack thinks about that often. How safety is an illusion we construct to make the world feel manageable. How predators understand that illusion and exploit it, positioning themselves in the spaces where we have let our guard down. How a camping trip, that quintessential wholesome family activity, can become a hunting ground for those who prey on the vulnerable. He still camps with Danny, but the experience is forever changed. He never relaxes completely. He always watches. And when he sees someone sitting alone at a campsite with no gear, facing the bathrooms with that peculiar stillness that suggests waiting rather than resting, he calls the Rangers immediately. Because he knows now that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look utterly ordinary, sitting patiently in plain sight, counting on everyone's reluctance to acknowledge that such evil could exist in such wholesome surroundings. Henry had been guiding wilderness treks for nearly 12 years, accumulating enough experience to handle almost any situation the backcountry could throw at him. He specialized in extended expeditions into remote areas where most tourists never ventured, places that required technical skills, physical endurance, and the kind of judgment that kept groups safe when they were days away from help. His reputation was solid enough that clients would specifically request him when booking trips through the outfitter company he worked for. The April trek into Yellowstone's most remote territory was supposed to be routine. 5 days, 4 clients, a circular route through the thoroughfare region that would cover nearly 40 miles of pristine wilderness. The group was small but experienced. 2 brothers from Colorado who backpacked regularly, a retired geologist who wanted to see the backcountry geology, and a photographer hoping to capture early spring landscapes. They were all prepared for the conditions. Snow still blanketed much of the high country, and temperatures at night would drop below freezing. They set out on a Tuesday morning under clear skies, hiking through forests still dormant from winter. The trail was well marked initially, but as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the markers became less frequent. This was intentional. The Park Service maintained minimal infrastructure in the thoroughfare to preserve its wild character. Henry navigated by GPS, topographic maps, and landmarks he had memorized from previous trips. On the second day, they discovered the first abandoned camp. It appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge overlooking a small meadow. A tent, still standing but with its door hanging open, sat in the center of the clearing. Gear was scattered around it in a pattern that suggested chaos rather than organization. Henry held up his hand to stop the group while he surveyed the scene. "Stay here," he told them, then approached the camp carefully. The tent was a North Face model, expensive and relatively new. Inside, he found a sleeping bag partially unzipped, a backpack with food still packed, and personal items scattered on the tent floor. But no person, he called out several times, his voice echoing across the meadow. No response. What disturbed him most were the tracks. Fresh boot prints led away from the tent toward the tree line, clearly visible in the patches of snow. But after about 30 feet, they simply stopped, not faded or obscured, but ended abruptly as if the person making them had vanished mid-stride. Henry photographed the scene and used his satellite phone to call park dispatch. He reported the location and described what they had found. The dispatcher promised to send rangers to investigate and asked Henry to continue his planned route unless he felt the situation posed immediate danger to his group. Henry agreed, though unease settled over him like a cold fog. They hiked for another 6 hours before making camp. The group was subdued, the abandoned tent weighing on everyone's mind. Henry tried to maintain a normal atmosphere, cooking dinner and telling stories about previous trips, but the effort felt forced. On the third day, they found another camp, This one was 5 miles from the first, in a completely different drainage. But the setup was eerily identical. Same brand of tent, same scattered gear pattern, same fresh boot prints leading away into nothing. Henry felt his skin prickle. This was beyond coincidence. He examined the campsite more carefully this time. The boot prints were the same size and tread pattern as the first site. Identical, as if made by the same person or the same boots. But that made no sense. The camps were separated by difficult terrain and a significant elevation change. No one could have moved between them and set up identical scenes in the time frame the evidence suggested. The geologist in their group, a man named Dr. Patterson, helped Henry document everything. They took measurements, photographs, GPS coordinates. Patterson examined the boot prints with professional interest and confirmed what Henry already suspected. They were not just similar. They were identical in every detail, as if someone had made one set of prints and then somehow duplicated them perfectly at a second location. That night, Henry barely slept. He lay in his tent listening to the wind move through the pines, his mind working through possibilities and finding none that made sense. In the morning, he called Park Dispatch again with an update. The dispatcher sounded genuinely concerned and promised that rangers were mobilizing a search effort. She asked if Henry wanted to abort his trip and return to the trailhead. He conferred with his clients and they agreed to continue. They were already more than halfway through the circuit, and returning would actually take longer than completing the planned route. On the fourth day, they found a third camp. This time, there was still a fire smoldering in the ring. Coals glowed red beneath ash, suggesting someone had been there within the past few hours. Food was cooking on a grate, a pot of what looked like dehydrated stew sitting over the heat. Steam rose from it. The tent door was closed but unzipped. Henry's heart hammered as he approached. He called out louder than before. "Hello, is anyone here? We are not a threat. We found your other camps and reported them to park rangers. Do you need help?" Silence. He looked back at his group, who stood in a tight cluster at the edge of the clearing, all of them visibly frightened now. Henry reached the tent and pulled the door flap open. Inside, he found a journal lying open on top of a sleeping bag. The pages were covered in handwriting, frantic and cramped. Henry picked it up and began reading, his hands starting to shake. The entries described a solo backpacking trip through the thoroughfare. Same dates they were hiking, same route. The writer described feeling watched, hearing sounds that did not belong, seeing movement in the trees that vanished when directly observed. Then the entries became more disturbing. The writer described seeing their own face in the distance, standing at the tree line, watching. They described hearing their own voice calling from the forest, using their name, saying things they had never said. The final entry, dated today, read, "I know I am not alone anymore. Something is following me. Something that looks like me. I see it every night now, standing just outside the firelight. It is learning. It is getting closer. I tried to leave, but found myself setting up camp again with no memory of deciding to do so. I think I have been here before. I think this has happened before. The camps I keep finding are mine. All of them. Different versions of me, trapped in this loop. If you are reading this, run. Get out of the thoroughfare. Do not let it see you. Do not let it learn your face." Henry lowered the journal, his mind reeling. He heard one of his clients gasp behind him and turned to see what had caught their attention. At the edge of the clearing, a figure stood watching them. For a moment, Henry thought it was another hiker. Then his brain processed what he was seeing, and his blood turned to ice. The figure was him. Same height, same build, same clothing down to the specific jacket and pack he was wearing. Same face. It was Henry. standing 50 feet away, staring at him with an expression that was not quite right. Too blank, too still, like a mask of his face rather than his actual face. They locked eyes across the clearing. The double raised one hand in a slow wave. The gesture was deliberate, mechanical, as if performed by someone who had observed waving but did not truly understand its purpose. "Run," Henry whispered to his group. Then louder, "Run!" They ran, crashed through the forest, abandoning any pretense of following trails or maintaining formation. Pure panic drove them, branches whipping at their faces, snow and mud splashing up from their boots. Henry risked one look back and saw the double following, not running, but walking with that same mechanical precision, matching their pace exactly despite the terrain. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath in a narrow ravine, the double was gone. But Henry knew with absolute certainty that it was still there, somewhere in the forest, learning, watching, waiting. They hiked through the night, navigation be damned, focused only on putting distance between themselves and whatever they had encountered. They reached a ranger station at dawn, stumbling out of the trees like refugees from a war zone. Henry tried to explain what they had seen, but the words sounded insane, even to him. Park rangers organized a search operation that lasted 3 weeks. They found 7 abandoned campsites, arranged in a rough circle within, a 10-mile radius of where Henry had seen his double. All identical. All with the same boot prints leading nowhere. The journal Henry had found disappeared from evidence, later reported as misplaced during processing. No official explanation was ever provided for the campsites or the tracks. Henry stopped guiding in that region. He still works as a wilderness guide, but he refuses trips into the thoroughfare. 2 years after the incident, he received a call from a park ranger he had never met. The ranger had found a campsite with Henry's name on the gear tags. Sleeping bag, backpack, even personal items with his initials. But Henry was home in Montana, 800 miles away. The ranger sent photos. The gear was identical to what Henry owned, down to specific wear patterns and repairs. The thoroughfare region was quietly closed to overnight camping shortly after. The official reason cited was wildlife management and habitat protection. But rangers who work the area know the real reason. They tell stories in hushed voices about the place where reality folds back on itself, where something lives that can mirror you perfectly, learn your patterns, become you. They say 7 hikers have vanished there since the 1970s, and their gear is always found arranged in camps that form perfect circles, as if marking the boundary of something that should not be crossed. Henry does not talk about that trip anymore. When pressed, he will only say that some places exist outside the rules that govern normal reality, and that the wilderness holds phenomena we were never meant to understand. He warns other guides to trust their instincts. If a place feels wrong, if you see something that should not be possible, if you encounter your own face staring back at you from the tree line, do not try to rationalize it. Do not try to understand it. Just run. And do not stop running until you are back in the world where cause and effect still function the way they should. Because in places like the thoroughfare, those rules do not always apply, and something there has learned to watch, to copy, to become. Whatever it takes from you, you will never get back. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, versions of those who stayed too long still walk, trapped in loops they can never escape, setting up camps they will abandon, following trails that lead nowhere, forever searching for an exit that exists in their memory, but not in their reality.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. This evening we journey deep into the frozen heart of Alaska, uncovering chilling accounts that most would never dare to speak aloud. Tonight's episode promises not only tales of horror, but glimpses into the realities faced by those who call Alaska's remote small towns home. Each story you are about to hear is anchored in first-hand testimony, gathered from individuals scattered across America and carefully brought to life from the disturbing memories that still haunt them. The authenticity of these accounts has been treated with utmost respect, and while some names and identifying details have been changed to protect those involved, the terror remains untouched. Prepare yourself for 8 of the most disturbing true experiences ever reported from Alaska's wilderness. If you have not joined the Buried Files community yet, remember to subscribe for new true horror stories every week. Activate the notification bell so you are always first to hear when another file is unearthed. Jolene Hawthorne had always been captivated by the idea of flight. Growing up in the flat plains of Minnesota, she would often lie beneath the open sky for hours, watching prop planes and commercial jets leave their long trails in the blue expanse above. From a young age, she knew her dreams were tethered to the clouds, destined to soar beyond the grounding earth. It was her passion and escape, a desire to see the world from a vantage point few others ever experienced. After years of diligent study and careful accumulation of flight hours, Jolene finally earned her pilot's wings. She began flying short regional hops around the Midwest, hauling cargo and learning the rigorous discipline demanded by the skies. But she soon realized that her true calling beckoned further north, to remote lands where flying was not just a profession but a lifeline. Her new post was in Alaska, flying supply missions into some of the most isolated villages on the continent. These communities depended on people like her to bring them essentials during the months when the Arctic winter held the land in its icy grip. Roads froze over or disappeared entirely beneath snowdrifts and ice, and the seas turned too treacherous for boats. In Kotzebue, a small Inupiat village hugging the edge of the Chukchi Sea, Jolene's flights were crucial to survival. She was no stranger to the brutal Arctic environment. She had trained extensively in cold weather survival, learned to anticipate sudden weather changes, and mastered the intricate dance of flying in low visibility, piercing snow and sub-zero temperatures. Each flight was a challenge of skill, nerve, and endurance. The isolation never bothered her much. She had always been comfortable in her own company, and the compensation for Arctic flying made the hardships worthwhile. This particular January morning dawned with an icy stillness that Jolene found almost unnerving. The sun barely broke the horizon, casting a faint pale light that seemed swallowed by heavy clouds. Temperatures hovered at 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the snow hung frozen, glittering faintly in the sparse daylight like countless tiny diamonds scattered across the landscape. Her aircraft for the supply run, a reliable de Havilland Beaver, was stocked fully with barrels of heating fuel, necessary to keep homes warm during the relentless cold. Crates of preserved food supplies, boxes of medical necessities including antibiotics and vaccinations, and small luxuries like children's books, batteries, and educational materials. Each crate represented lives dependent on her for survival. The weight distribution was perfect, fuel tanks topped off, and weather reports showed manageable conditions for the 3-hour flight north. Approaching the Kotzebue airstrip was usually a welcome sight, a sign of familiar faces and bustling life. The village council always arranged for workers to meet the supply flights, and children would often gather to watch the plane land, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Yet when Jolene touched down that day, she was met with an unnerving silence. Gone were the usual workers unloading freight, the dogs barking in greeting, the murmur of the village waking after another night of Arctic darkness. Jolene's heart hammered with an unsettling foreboding as she disembarked, the cold numbness of the air pressing against every inch of exposed skin. She breathed deeply, the chill air stinging her lungs, half expecting the usual warmth of life around her, but instead greeted only with oppressive, unnatural quiet. The wind that typically carried sounds of daily village life, children calling to each other, adults discussing the day's tasks, sled dogs yipping, was absent. With the sled hooked behind the plane, Jolene began hauling her cargo across the runway toward the town center. The snow-crusted paths lay deserted, footsteps muffled beneath fresh snowfall. Houses, though neat and orderly, showed signs of abandonment. Curtains still drawn back as if residents had left suddenly, coats dangling on hooks by doorways, untended fires reduced to cold ash in stone hearths. Smoke should have been rising from every chimney in weather this cold, but the sky remained clear. A soft whisper of wind stirred through the trees, carrying nothing but a chilling sense of absence. Jolene called out, her voice fragile in the vast stillness. "Is anyone here? We have supplies. Help has arrived." But no reply answered her desperate plea. The echo of her own voice seemed to mock her from the empty buildings. The grocery store was the next stop. Usually alive with the daily rhythms of the village, today it stood frozen in time. The front doors were thrown open as if escape had been sudden and urgent. Shelves remained undisturbed, stocked with canned goods, and the smell of stale air lingered. A tattered newspaper lay scattered on the floor, dated 2 weeks previous. Money still sat in the cash register, and a half-eaten sandwich on the counter had begun to mold. Trying to reach the council office via radio offered no comfort. Only static hissed back in response. Her emergency frequencies produced nothing but white noise. Her concern deepened, but training pushed her forward. In situations like this, protocol demanded a thorough search before declaring an emergency. Pressing on to the community center, Jolene found chaos stark and still. Overturned chairs and scattered papers whispered of hasty departure. A calendar on the wall remained frozen on December with no markings beyond the 15th. Her flashlight beam captured frozen snapshots of a life abruptly halted. Coffee cups still sitting on tables, meeting notes scattered on the floor, a child's drawing of a polar bear taped to one wall. Suddenly, a door upstairs slammed sharply, echoing through the empty halls. Jolene's heart pounded against her chest as she ascended cautiously, flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of her. The rooms were empty save for scattered personal effects. Books left open, a doll lying face down on a cracked floorboard, winter clothes strewn about as if people had dressed quickly. On one wall, a solitary note caught her eye, its message smeared but unmistakable. "We fled into the storm. The shadow is coming. Do not follow us into the dark." A shiver of dread ran through her that had nothing to do with the cold. What shadow? And what kind of storm had forced the villagers to abandon their homes so suddenly, leaving behind everything they owned? She pressed on, venturing to the more remote surrounding homes, hoping to find someone who could explain what had happened. Here, signs of sudden departure were even more telling. Abandoned snowmobiles half buried in deep drifts, sleds tipped on their sides with supplies scattered in the snow, and children's toys left strewn as though the owners had been called away mid-play. Some houses had doors standing wide open, letting in the killing cold that would have frozen any remaining pipes within hours. Through the biting cold, her breath a dense cloud, Jolene noticed fresh footprints that were unbroken by new snow. The tracks led away from Kotzebue's center and stretched toward the frozen shoreline, a narrow path carved across the ice. The footprints were deep and hurried, as if made by people running in panic. Despite the gnawing pit of fear in her stomach, instinct and compassion urged her to follow. Perhaps some villagers had sought shelter in the fishing huts along the shore. Perhaps they were waiting for rescue, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The air shifted as she reached the ice. The vast expanse of the Chukchi Sea reflected the shimmering aurora dancing in green and violet ribbons across the sky. It was both breathtaking and haunting, a surreal backdrop to the mystery before her. The aurora seemed unusually active, casting an otherworldly glow that made the ice appear to pulse with its own inner light. From behind a weathered fishing shack, a figure materialized. Pale and trembling, yet profoundly alive, the man seemed haunted by the elements and the solitude alike. His clothes were tattered, face gaunt from hunger and exposure, but his eyes held a desperate relief at seeing another human being. I was waiting, he whispered, voice cracked from cold and exhaustion. Everyone else, they fled into the storm and never came back. I stayed behind, hoping someone would come, hoping the supply plane would arrive. His name was Isaac, a local fisherman who had become separated during a sudden and violent blizzard that had descended upon the village 2 weeks prior. The storm had not been typical, he relayed between chattering teeth. It brought with it a darkness that was almost tangible, a shadow moving with the wind, stalking the village streets like something alive and malevolent. Isaac described how the shadow seemed to drive people mad with fear, corralling the frightened villagers and forcing them to flee into the wilderness where many succumbed to the unrelenting cold. Those who tried to resist or hide were found the next morning, dead but unmarked, as if their life force had simply been drained away. Jolene tended to him, wrapping the thin man in soft blankets from her emergency kit and sharing water and food from her pack. His story chilled her more than the Arctic wind, but she focused on the immediate need to keep him alive until help could arrive. Her mind reeled but focused. Understanding the gravity of the situation, she radioed the Kotzebue airport to request emergency medevac assistance. The voice that answered was strained and worried. Other pilots had reported strange atmospheric disturbances in the region, and several aircraft had gone missing in recent weeks. The answer was grim and urgent. Worsening weather conditions meant rescue efforts would be delayed. High winds and whiteout conditions had already grounded other flights, and the medevac helicopter would not be able to reach them until the storm front passed, possibly not until the following afternoon. Jolene refused to surrender to hopelessness. She had trained for situations like this, though never one quite so bizarre. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she began preparing for a long, cold night in the fishing hut. Throughout the long, bitter night, she kept a small fire burning inside the fishing hut, her senses sharp for any sign of danger. Every slight noise made her heart leap, the brittle snap of a branch outside, the whispered brush of snow against the window, the occasional groan of the hut's wooden frame settling in the cold. Her imagination painted sinister shapes just outside the fragile circle of firelight, and Isaac's mumbled warnings about the shadow did nothing to calm her nerves. The feeling of being watched was constant, gnawing at her calm. Several times she thought she glimpsed movement through the frosted windows, but when she peered outside with her flashlight, nothing was there except swirling snow and the dancing aurora overhead. As dawn's pale fingers finally crept over the horizon, a distant thrum shattered the silence. The whop-whop of helicopter blades sliced through the cold air, growing steadily louder until the bright orange rescue aircraft appeared through the morning haze. Isaac was rescued, carried into the safety of warmth and medicine, his frost-bitten hands and feet requiring immediate medical attention. As the helicopter lifted off, Jolene took a final lingering look at the village. Kotzebue stood lost and silent, a ghost of itself beneath the pale Arctic sun. The tale of the last supply run spread quickly, whispered among pilots and locals alike as a warning. Aviation authorities launched an investigation but found no rational explanation for the village's abandonment. Search teams sent to look for the missing villagers found only scattered remains in the wilderness, victims of exposure and the brutal cold. Many avoided flying into Kotzebue after dark, wary of the shadow said to haunt its streets, a malevolent force consuming land and life. The village was eventually declared uninhabitable and removed from official flight schedules. though some say lights can still be seen there on certain nights when the aurora is particularly active. Though Jolene moved on to less taxing routes in milder climates, her experience remained etched in her mind, a stark reminder that nature's wilderness holds secrets and dangers no one should underestimate. She never flew in Alaska again, and whenever anyone asked her why she had left such a lucrative position, she would simply say that some places are better left undisturbed. Some shadows do not fade with the coming dawn, and some mysteries are too dangerous to solve. The last supply run taught her that there are forces in the world that human understanding cannot fully grasp, and sometimes the wisest course of action is simply to flee and never look back. Rodriguez Rod Espinoza was never one to believe much in the strange or supernatural. Growing up in the sprawling deserts of West Texas, his life was grounded in practicality, working the oil fields by day and fixing fishing boats at night. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, his face weathered by the harsh southwestern sun, and his worldview shaped by the reliable predictability of machinery and honest labor. When an opportunity came to work in Alaska as a commercial fisherman, he jumped at the chance, eager for a fresh start and an adventure he could brag about back home in the bars of El Paso. Nome was unlike anything Rod had ever experienced. The vast white plains of frozen sea stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional cluster of fishing huts and the jagged silhouette of distant mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the pale sky. The midnight sun was a strange companion during the summer months, casting an ever-present glow that blurred day into night and left Rod's internal clock completely confused. But it was during the harsh winter months that he truly began to understand the mystique of this remote place. It was here that Rod learned of Nome's annual ice fishing contest, a beloved tradition that brought together the scattered fishing community during the harshest season of the year. The contest was not just about catching fish. It was a celebration of survival, endurance, and the unbreakable bonds that held the community together when the outside world seemed impossibly far away. At first, Rod was hesitant to participate. The locals eyed him as an outsider, their weathered faces skeptical of his lack of experience in the frigid Arctic waters. His Texas drawl stood out sharply against their clipped northern accents, and his techniques honed on warm water species seemed clumsy and ineffective on the frozen Bering Sea. But his determination and natural fishing skill eventually won him grudging acceptance among the tight-knit group of fishermen and women who made their living from these unforgiving waters. The tournament was a grueling test of endurance and technique. Competitors had to drill through several feet of solid ice using hand-cranked augers, the work exhausting in the extreme cold. They had to brave the constant Arctic wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, and they had to possess the patience to wait for elusive catches in conditions that would drive most people indoors. The fish that lived beneath the ice, cod, burbot, and Arctic char, were prized not just for their size, but for their ability to thrive in this harsh environment. The day of the contest dawned with crystal-clear skies and bitter cold that made the air itself seem to crackle with electricity. The temperature registered at 42 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. The air smelled of wood smoke mixed with sea salt, carried on winds that swept across hundreds of miles of frozen tundra before reaching the coast. Bundled in thick layers of caribou fur and modern insulated gear, Rod joined a crowd of fishermen and women, their faces already reddened by the cold, but their eyes bright with excitement and competitive spirit. Throughout the morning, Rod marveled at the skilled hands around him. Veterans who could read the ice like a book, knowing exactly where to drill and how deep to set their lines. These were people who had learned their craft from parents and grandparents, knowledge passed down through generations of Arctic survival. Conversations drifted between friendly banter about past catches and hushed warnings about the sea's deeper secrets. Stories were shared of strange happenings beneath the ice, Whispered rumors and folklore passed down through generations like cautionary tales around a campfire. Old Henrik, a Norwegian fisherman who had been working these waters for 30 years, told Rod about the Sila, ancient Inuit spirits that were said to control the weather and the sea. "The ice has memory," Henrik said, his breath forming white clouds as he spoke. "It remembers every soul that has passed through these waters, and sometimes it calls to them." Rod chuckled quietly to himself, dismissing the tales as the superstitions of isolated people who had spent too many long winters in darkness. He was a man of reason and practical experience, and the frozen world offered no place for old wives' tales and supernatural nonsense. Yet as the contest progressed into the afternoon, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere around them. The ice beneath their feet started to hum softly at first, a low vibrational drone that seemed to resonate through their boots and into their bones. The sound was almost subliminal, felt more than heard, like standing too close to massive electrical transformers. Fishers paused in their work, casting nervous glances toward one another, their eyes drawn to the frozen surface with dawning unease. Rod felt the unsettling vibration too, a faint tremor that seemed to quicken and pulse beneath the vast frozen sea. It reminded him of the way the ground would shake when heavy machinery passed by the oil rigs back in Texas, but there was no machinery here, nothing but ice and water and the endless expanse of the Arctic wilderness. Suddenly, without warning, fishing lines began to jerk taut with a ferocity that sent spools flying off reels and knocked several fishermen off their feet. Rod gripped his rod with both hands, feeling an enormous weight on the other end of his line. He pulled hard, expecting to haul up the largest cod of his life. But what emerged from the black water beneath the ice defied all reason and explanation. Entwined upon his line was a grotesque creature that seemed to be composed of equal parts fish and living shadow. Its skin was mottled black and slimy, glistening unnaturally in the pale sunlight as if covered in some kind of phosphorescent slime. The thing's eyes glowed with a cold, alien light that seemed to pierce straight through to Rod's soul. As the creature writhed on his hook, it emitted a guttural, mournful groan that sounded disturbingly like human speech, though in no language Rod had ever heard. Chaos erupted across the frozen fishing grounds. Lines snapped under impossible strain. Ice augers and tackle boxes were abandoned as their owners fled in terror, and men and women who had faced down polar bears and survived Arctic storms scrambled for safety like frightened children. Strange shapes began to emerge from the water beneath the ice, creatures that seemed to be part fish, part living shadow, moving beneath the frozen surface like phantoms with glowing hollow eyes that tracked the fleeing fishermen with malevolent intelligence. The temperature seemed to drop even further as whispers and cries rose from the assembled crowd. Chilling voices echoed from the depths beneath them, speaking in an eerie chorus of lament and warning that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were unintelligible but filled with such profound sadness and rage that several of the fishermen began to weep uncontrollably, overwhelmed by emotions that were not their own. Rod stood rooted in place by absolute terror, his rational mind unable to process what he was witnessing. The howl of the Arctic wind was completely drowned out by the supernatural chorus of moans and whispers rising from beneath their feet. The ice itself began to groan and crack under the weight of whatever was trying to push through from below, the sound echoing their own primal fear and threatening to give way to the hungry darkness of the sea. The voices seemed to be telling stories, fragments of lives cut short, tales of drowning and freezing and being pulled down into the depths by something that should not exist. Rod could almost make out individual words in the chaos, names and pleas for help from people who had died in these waters decades or even centuries ago. Panic overtook the entire crowd, and they fled toward the safety of the distant shore, leaving behind expensive gear and a lifetime's worth of fishing dreams. Snowmobiles roared to life and raced across the ice, some carrying multiple passengers who clung desperately to avoid being left behind with whatever had awakened beneath the frozen surface. Rescue teams arrived several hours later, dispatched by concerned family members when the fishermen failed to return at the expected time. What they found was nothing but frozen silence stretching across the Bering Sea. The ice was smooth and unmarked, bearing no sign of the terror that had driven an entire community into panicked flight. The abandoned fishing equipment had already begun to freeze solid, and the holes that had been drilled through the ice showed no signs of the unnatural creatures that had emerged from them. Local authorities dismissed the incident as a case of mass hysteria brought on by extreme cold and isolation, though they could not explain why experienced Arctic fishermen would abandon thousands of dollars worth of equipment without cause. The official report mentioned possible methane emissions from the seafloor causing hallucinations, but privately the investigators admitted they had never seen anything like it. The elders of the community whispered of the ice claiming more than fish that day. It had claimed their faith in the natural order of things and their understanding of what was possible in this world. Some spoke of ancient curses awakened by too much disturbance of the sea's depths, while others believed the spirits of those lost to the ice had finally found a way to make their presence known to the living. Rod left Alaska shortly thereafter, bearing psychological scars that would never fully heal. The nightmares started almost immediately. Dreams of black water filled with reaching hands and glowing eyes, of voices calling his name from beneath the ice. He sought treatment from doctors and therapists in Texas, but none could help him forget the sound of that otherworldly chorus or the sight of creatures that should not exist. The annual ice fishing contest in Nome was never held again. The community vote was unanimous. Some traditions were not worth the risk of awakening whatever slept beneath the frozen sea. The fishing grounds where the incident occurred were informally designated as off-limits, though no official warning signs were ever posted. Fishermen simply knew to avoid that particular stretch of ice, passing the knowledge along to newcomers as part of their informal education in Arctic survival. In the years that followed, other strange incidents were reported from the same general area. Pilots flying overhead claimed to see lights moving beneath the ice, and ships passing through the region during the brief summer months reported unusual sonar readings and equipment malfunctions. But these incidents were always isolated and quickly forgotten, dismissed as natural phenomena or equipment failure. Rod never returned to commercial fishing, instead finding work in construction back in Texas, where the ground stayed solid beneath his feet, and the only things lurking in the darkness were familiar and earthly. But sometimes, on particularly cold nights, he swears he can still hear those voices calling from beneath the ice, reminding him that some mysteries are too dangerous to investigate and some traditions too deadly to continue. The ice fishing contest that was supposed to bring the community together had instead revealed something that drove them apart, forcing them to confront the reality that their understanding of the world was incomplete and that some forces were beyond human comprehension or control. And deep beneath the frozen waves of the Bering Sea, the shadows continue to wait patiently for their next chance to surface, forever hungry and forever calling to those who dare venture too far onto the ice. Marcus Delacroix never expected to find himself in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, when he graduated with his communications engineering degree from Louisiana State University. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and the remote communications facility job in Bethel paid 3 times what he could make back home in Baton Rouge. The contract was for 18 months, maintaining the radio tower infrastructure that kept this isolated town of 4,000 connected to the outside world. What the job posting had not mentioned was that most of that work would be done alone during the endless Alaskan winter nights. The Bethel Communications Center sat 5 miles outside town, a squat concrete building surrounded by a forest of towering radio antennas that stretched up into the dark sky like metal fingers grasping at the aurora borealis. Marcus had been on the job for 3 weeks, learning the systems from his predecessor, a grizzled technician named Pete, who seemed eager to leave Alaska behind. Pete had been unusually quiet during the training period, showing Marcus the equipment with mechanical precision but offering little conversation beyond the technical requirements. On Marcus's final day of training, Pete finally opened up as they shared a thermos of coffee in the control room. The walls were lined with banks of radio equipment, their LED displays casting an eerie green glow in the dim lighting. Outside, the wind howled across the tundra, rattling the building's metal siding with a sound like distant applause. "Listen, Marcus," Pete had said, his weathered face serious in the electronic glow. "You are going to hear things up here that do not make sense." Radio waves bounce strange in this part of Alaska. Atmospheric conditions, northern lights, all sorts of scientific explanations for what might come through those speakers. He gestured toward the communication arrays. "But there are some transmissions you just need to ignore. Turn the volume down, log them as interference, and move on with your shift." Marcus had laughed it off at the time, assuming Pete was just trying to spook the new guy. But as the Louisiana native settled into his routine over the following weeks, he began to understand what Pete meant. The radio equipment picked up all manner of strange signals bouncing around the Alaskan atmosphere. Sometimes it was Russian military chatter from across the Bering Sea. Other times it caught fragments of conversations from aircraft flying overhead or ship-to-shore communications from vessels in the Bering Strait. Most nights, Marcus worked alone in the communications center from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., monitoring the equipment and performing routine maintenance on the transmitters that kept Bethel connected to the outside world. The isolation never bothered him much. He had always been comfortable with his own company, and the job paid well enough that he could tolerate the loneliness for 18 months. He brought books to read during the quiet hours and had installed a small television in the break room to help pass the time. It was during his 6th week on the job that Marcus first heard the voice that would change everything. He was performing a routine check on the emergency communication frequencies when a woman's voice crackled through the static, clear as day, despite the poor signal quality. "This is Jennifer Walsh calling for help. My coordinates are 61.4 degrees north, 161.8 degrees west. I have been stranded here for 2 days. My snowmobile broke down and I need immediate assistance. Please respond if anyone can hear this transmission." Marcus immediately grabbed his logbook and started transcribing the message. Emergency calls were rare but not unheard of in the Alaskan bush, and it was his responsibility to relay any distress signals to the appropriate rescue services. He tried to respond on the same frequency, but the transmission seemed to be one way only. The woman repeated her message twice more before the signal faded back into static. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes trying to re-establish contact with the stranded woman while simultaneously calling the Alaska State Troopers to report the emergency. The coordinates she had provided placed her somewhere in the remote wilderness southwest of Bethel, an area known for its dangerous terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. The trooper on duty took down all the information and promised to dispatch a search team at first light. 3 days later, Marcus learned from the local newspaper that no rescue operation had found anyone at those coordinates. The search team had discovered the wreckage of a snowmobile, but it had been there for years, partially buried under snow and vegetation. More disturbing was the discovery they made while investigating the area more thoroughly. The remains they found nearby were identified as Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife researcher who had gone missing in that exact location 7 years earlier. Marcus tried to rationalize the experience. Radio waves could travel vast distances under the right atmospheric conditions. Perhaps he had somehow picked up an old transmission that had been bouncing around the ionosphere for years before finally reaching his equipment. It was a stretch scientifically, but stranger things had happened in the world of radio communications. But the rational explanations became harder to maintain as the weeks passed, and similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. 2 weeks after the Jennifer Walsh transmission, Marcus heard another distress call during his night shift. This time, it was a man's voice, rough and desperate, identifying himself as Robert Cunningham. He claimed to be lost in a blizzard near the same general coordinates, begging for someone to send help before his supplies ran out. Marcus followed the same protocol, documenting the transmission and contacting the authorities. The next day, he learned that Robert Cunningham had been a geologist who disappeared in that area 5 years earlier. His body had been recovered months after his disappearance, along with evidence that he had indeed been caught in a severe blizzard and died of exposure. As winter deepened and the nights grew longer, the phantom transmissions became a regular occurrence. Marcus began to dread the overnight shifts, knowing that at some point during the dark hours, his equipment would pick up another desperate voice from the past. The calls always came from the same general area, always from people who had died years or even decades earlier in the remote wilderness southwest of Bethel. The most disturbing transmission came on a particularly cold February night when the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the aurora borealis painted the sky in ghostly green ribbons. Marcus was reading in the break room when the emergency frequency crackled to life with a transmission that made his blood freeze. "This is Marcus Delacroix calling for help. I am stranded at coordinates 61.4 degrees north, 161.8 degrees west. My vehicle has broken down and I am injured. Please send help immediately. I repeat, this is Marcus Delacroix requesting immediate assistance." The voice was unmistakably his own, though distorted by static and distance. Marcus listened in horror as his own voice repeated the distress call twice more before fading back into the white noise of the radio equipment. His hands shaking, he checked the transmission logs and confirmed that the signal had indeed come from the same coordinates where all the other phantom calls originated. Marcus spent the rest of that shift sitting in stunned silence, staring at the radio equipment and trying to process what he had heard. There was no rational explanation for receiving a distress call in his own voice from coordinates he had never visited. The implications were too terrifying to fully contemplate, but one possibility kept forcing its way into his thoughts. Were the transmissions predictions rather than echoes from the past? Was the radio equipment somehow picking up signals from people who were destined to die in that cursed patch of wilderness? The thought filled him with a dread so profound that he could barely function for the remainder of his shift. The next morning, Marcus drove straight to the airport and purchased the first available ticket back to Louisiana. He never returned to collect his belongings from the apartment in Bethel, and he never completed his 18-month contract with the communications company. The job was eventually filled by another technician from the lower 48, a young man from Ohio who lasted exactly 6 weeks before he too abandoned his post and fled Alaska without explanation. Marcus now works for a television station in New Orleans, safely surrounded by the familiar sounds and sights of his home state. But sometimes, late at night when atmospheric conditions are just right, he swears he can still hear those phantom voices calling for help from the Alaskan wilderness. And he has never forgotten the sound of his own voice, desperate and afraid, calling out from coordinates he prays he will never visit. The communications center in Bethel has changed hands several times since Marcus left, but it continues to operate with a high turnover rate among overnight technicians. The local authorities no longer respond to emergency transmissions from the coordinates southwest of town, having learned that any rescue attempts in that area inevitably end in tragedy. The wilderness there remains empty and silent except for the phantom voices that continue to broadcast their eternal pleas for help into the cold Alaskan night. Destiny Washington had always been drawn to adventure, but nothing in her comfortable life in Washington, D.C. had prepared her for the brutal realities of seasonal work in Alaska. The 24-year-old political science graduate had signed up for a summer job at the Pacific Salmon Processing Facility in Ketchikan. Lured by the promise of good wages and the chance to experience the last frontier firsthand, what she discovered during the long Alaskan nights would haunt her for the rest of her life. The cannery sat on the edge of Tongass Narrows like a massive metal beast, its corrugated steel walls streaked with rust and salt spray. Built in the 1940s, the facility had processed millions of pounds of salmon over the decades, employing seasonal workers from all over the world who came north for the intense but lucrative fishing season. Destiny arrived in May when the daylight stretched nearly 20 hours and the air still carried the crisp bite of winter. Her supervisor, a gruff Alaskan native named Charlie Tutok, assigned her to the night shift on the processing line. The work was exhausting, standing for 12 hours straight, gutting and cleaning fish in the refrigerated facility while industrial machinery roared around them. But the pay was excellent, and Destiny found a certain meditative rhythm in the repetitive work, her hands moving automatically while her mind wandered. For the first month, everything seemed normal. The cannery operated around the clock during peak season, with 3 shifts of workers keeping the production line moving. Destiny worked alongside other seasonal employees, college students from the lower 48, immigrant workers sending money back to their families, and local Alaskans supplementing their incomes. The night shift was smaller and quieter, with only essential personnel maintaining operations while the fishing boats were out at sea. It was during her second month that Destiny began to notice the anomalies. She was working alone in the secondary processing area, a section of the cannery where fish were sorted and prepared for canning, when she heard the familiar sound of machinery starting up in the primary processing room next door. This was unusual since the primary line only operated when fresh fish were being brought in from the boats, and no deliveries were scheduled until morning. Curious, Destiny left her station and peered through the small window that connected the 2 areas. What she saw made her blood run cold. The massive processing conveyor was running at full speed, and salmon were moving down the line in perfect formation. But the facility had received no fresh deliveries in over 6 hours. The fish looked wrong somehow, their scales dull and lifeless, their eyes clouded with an oily film that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting in strange ways. She tried the door to the primary processing area, but it was locked from the inside. When she radioed her supervisor, Charlie told her that the primary line had been shut down hours ago and that no one else was in that section of the building. But Destiny could see the machinery running, could hear the rhythmic thump of fish dropping into processing bins, could smell the strong odor of salmon flooding through the ventilation system. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. Always during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when Destiny was alone in her section of the cannery, the primary processing line would mysteriously come to life. She began keeping a detailed log of the incidents, noting the exact times, the sounds she heard, and the smells that accompanied the phantom operations. What disturbed her most was the fish themselves. During her daytime explorations of the facility, when she should have been sleeping in her cramped dormitory room, Destiny discovered that the processing bins in the primary area were always full of salmon after these mysterious night runs. But when she examined the fish more closely, she realized they were not from the current season's catch. The species were wrong, varieties that had not been seen in Alaska waters for decades. The flesh was discolored and had a waxy texture that felt nothing like fresh fish. When she brought her concerns to Charlie, he dismissed them with an uncomfortable laugh. "Old buildings make strange noises," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Equipment runs on timers sometimes. You are just not used to the sounds yet." But Destiny noticed that he never volunteered to work the night shift himself, and when she pressed for more information about the cannery's history, he became evasive and changed the subject. It was Martha Kayahat, an elderly Tlingit woman who worked in the administration office, who finally told Destiny the truth. Martha had grown up in Ketchikan and remembered when the cannery was built, displacing a traditional fishing camp that had operated on the same site for hundreds of years. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that place," Martha said quietly, glancing around the empty break room to make sure they would not be overheard. "Before the whites came, our people caught salmon there every summer for generations. The spirits of the fish were honored, thanked for their sacrifice. Traditional protocols were followed to ensure the salmon would return each year." She paused to sip her coffee, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "When they built this place, they ignored all of that, tore down the sacred sites, poured concrete over the ceremonial areas, started processing fish like they were just commodities instead of living beings with spirits. My grandmother said the salmon spirits would not be ignored forever, that someday they would find a way to continue their ancient migration with or without our permission." Destiny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the refrigerated air. "You think the fish I am seeing are spirits?" Martha nodded solemnly. "The old salmon runs that used to come through here before overfishing and climate change disrupted everything. They are still following the ancient pathways, still trying to complete their life cycle. The cannery was built on top of their spiritual highway, but that does not mean they stopped using it." That night, Destiny decided to investigate more thoroughly. She positioned herself where she could observe the primary processing area directly and waited. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the machinery roared to life. But this time, instead of just watching through the window, Destiny used her security key card to unlock the connecting door. The sight that greeted her defied all rational explanation. The conveyor belt was indeed running, covered with salmon that moved with their own internal motion despite being obviously dead for decades. Their scales had the translucent quality of old bone, and their eyes glowed with a faint phosphorescent light. The smell was overwhelming, not the clean scent of fresh fish, but the musty, organic odor of something that had been underwater for far too long. As Destiny watched in horrified fascination, the ghost salmon moved through the processing equipment with mechanical precision. Cutting blades descended in rows, sorting mechanisms activated, and canning machines sealed products that should not have existed. But when she looked more closely at the operation, she realized that nothing was actually being cut or processed. The machinery went through all the motions, but the fish remained whole and untouched, as if the entire process was a kind of spiritual theater, an endless reenactment of their transformation from living creatures to commercial products. The most terrifying moment came when one of the ghost salmon on the conveyor belt turned its ancient head and looked directly at her. Its mouth opened and closed silently as if trying to speak, and Destiny heard something that might have been words carried on the recycled air of the facility. She could not make out the specific sounds, but the meaning was unmistakable. A mixture of sadness, anger, and an inexplicable longing for something that had been lost. Destiny backed slowly toward the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the roar of the machinery. As she reached for the handle, all the equipment suddenly stopped at once, plunging the facility into silence. The conveyor belt was empty, the processing bins were clean, and the overwhelming smell of ancient fish disappeared as if it had never existed. She quit her job the next morning, packing her belongings and booking the first flight back to Washington, D.C. Before she left, Martha Keahat sought her out and pressed a small carved pendant into her hand. A traditional salmon design carved from whale bone. "For protection," the elderly woman said, "in case they followed you home." For months after returning to D.C., Destiny was plagued by nightmares about glowing fish eyes and the sound of processing machinery running in empty buildings. She changed careers, abandoning her plans for graduate school in political science and instead pursuing a degree in indigenous studies, focusing on the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge and modern industrial practices. She never returned to Alaska, but she often wondered about the Pacific Salmon Processing Facility and whether the ghost salmon still ran their eternal processing line during the quiet hours of the night. In her research, she discovered that similar phenomena had been reported at industrial sites built on traditional hunting and fishing grounds throughout the Arctic, places where the old agreements between humans and the natural world had been forgotten or ignored. The carved salmon pendant that Martha had given her sat on Destiny's desk as she worked, a constant reminder that the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the past and the present, were far more permeable than most people realized. And sometimes, late at night, when she was working alone in her apartment, she would swear she could hear the distant sound of processing machinery and smell the unmistakable scent of ancient fish carrying messages from a world that modern society had tried very hard to forget. The spirits of the salmon continued their eternal migration, processing through facilities that existed in both the physical and spiritual realms, following pathways that had been established long before humans arrived on the continent and would continue long after the last cannery had rusted away. They were patient, persistent, and utterly indifferent to human schedules and industrial efficiency. They had work to do, ancient protocols to follow, and no amount of concrete or steel could stop them from completing their journey. Destiny Washington had learned that some jobs came with responsibilities that extended far beyond the terms of employment, and that some workplaces operated according to rules that were much older and more complex than anything covered in an employee handbook. The cannery continued to process its phantom catch every night, and somewhere in the endless cycle of spiritual fish moving through ghostly machinery, the old agreements were still being honored by beings that remembered when respect for the natural world was not just a philosophical concept, but a matter of survival. Kimiko Nakamura Williams had always believed that the world was deeper, stranger, and more mysterious than most gave it credit for. As a 29-year-old award-winning photographer from Portland, Oregon, she specialized in extreme landscape shots, preferring storms, mountains, volcanic fields, and the wildest, loneliest places she could find. But none of her adventures in the lower 48 compared to what Alaska had begun to mean to her. The land was Earth's memory, the sky a living canvas, and beneath it lived legends and darkness that no camera could fully capture. It was the third time she had come to Utqiagvik, the northernmost settlement in the United States, chasing the fabled auroras. This winter, storms had battered the coast for weeks, keeping most residents huddled indoors. Kimiko was restless. Her partner Samuel texted regular warnings from Anchorage. "Stay in the hotel, play it safe, the polar night is dangerous, you know the stories." But she had grown impatient, and after a particularly fierce blizzard finally cleared, Kimiko packed her camera bag, extra batteries, her tripod, thermal layers, 2 flasks of tea, and set out alone into the barren darkness of the North Slope's untamed tundra. To Kimiko, night in Alaska was not the simple closing of a curtain, but a transformation of reality. She trudged through powdery snowbanks, the ice crunching beneath her boots, her breath rising in shining clouds that danced in the pale glow of her headlamp. Out over the flat horizon, ribbons of green and violet shimmered through the thin clouds. Her first sign in days that the auroras were returning. All she wanted, she told herself, was one perfect shot. The northern lights twisting above a skeletal driftwood fence, the twin bluffs in the background, a faint glow on the horizon, some hint of the wild, cold stars above. She set up her tripod, checked her exposure, and waited, heart beating time with the silent pulse of the Arctic air. Around her, the silence was profound, a living, sentient thing. Hours passed in stillness. The auroras strengthened, swirling curtains climbing higher and burning more brightly. Kimiko clicked frame after frame, awed by the ever-shifting choreography overhead. But something was different tonight. The lights rippled in strange new ways, converging into arches so defined they looked almost unnatural, segmented like a stained glass window shattered across the sky. She zoomed in on her long lens, seeking detail. And behind the aurora, through it, she saw shadows, a flicker of movement that didn't belong. Long, spindly forms, deeper than black. Not the shadows of clouds or mountain, but figures tall as telephone poles with arms outstretched as though trying to tear through the veil of light. She blinked, wiped her lens for frost. For a moment she convinced herself it was an illusion, tricks of the eye, perhaps pareidolia, the brain's desperate attempt to force pattern on cosmic chaos. But it happened again. Then again. Each photo, the outlines clear as ice crystal, the shadows moving as the aurora shifted, drifting closer to the foreground. Desperate to stay rational, Kimiko adjusted settings and extended her exposure. Her camera's screen flickered in the biting dark. She clicked, counted, clicked again. In the 10th frame, one of the shadows had come nearer to the camera than before. Now sharply defined, its face a hollow emptiness, arms angled as if reaching forward. A deep surge of terror crawled up her spine. They weren't tricks of technology. She felt it, a pressure like static electricity, as though the air itself turned sentient, humming quietly with menace. At that very moment, another subtler sensation began, a ringing in her ears, growing louder until it seemed to vibrate in her skull. Kimiko's vision pulsed at the edges. She tried to pack up, but her hands moved clumsily, her sense of balance off. The lights overhead quickened, dancing in frenetic spirals, illuminating not only the land, but what now stood openly upon it. All around her, in the spaces where the aurora was brightest, the shadows stood, dozens, maybe hundreds, tall and gaunt, their forms semi-transparent but distinctly apart from the night. They pressed at the borders of the real, leaning in, the ground beneath them shimmering like disturbed puddles. Kimiko staggered backwards, falling to one knee. For a brief nightmarish instant, the air itself seemed to split with an inaudible scream. Then impossibly, the shadows began to move in her direction, sliding across the snow without disturbing a flake. In her mind, she heard a cacophony, dozens of distant wordless voices full of longing and despair. Each voice shaped like a memory she could not recall. She grabbed her camera, abandoning her tripod and nearly crawling back toward her snowmobile. Every few yards, she fought the urge to glance behind her, to see whether the silent figures had gained on her. But terror propelled her forward. When Kimiko reached her snowmobile, it would not start. The electronics flickered weakly, then died, as if the batteries had been drained by something pouring out of the sky. For long minutes, her only company was the crackling static of her nerves and the swirling luminance overhead. In desperation, she pulled out her emergency radio and attempted to call for help, but only a high, ghostly wail came through, mingled with what sounded like distant voices uttering unspeakable syllables. Sobbing, Kimiko huddled beside her pack, scanning her photos while her numbed fingers struggled to function. In every frame, the shadows had come closer, until one frame showed a face just outside her headlamp's glow, its features an agonizing ambiguity, perhaps pleading, perhaps hungry, perhaps both. For hours she sat there, listening to the auroras hum like the world's saddest violin, waiting for the dawn that would never come. In the Arctic winter, the sun rose only for a handful of moments each day and would not return in earnest for weeks. She drifted in and out of shivering sleep, haunted by visions of impossibly long arms reaching for her, by eyes she could never quite see. Eventually, morning brought a search party, a group of Utqiagvik locals who had seen her hastily abandon tripod and followed her snowmobile's tracks by headlamp and intuition. They found Kimiko shivering, eyes wild, clutching her camera like a lifeline. They bundled her onto their sled and sped her back to town, where elders muttered blessings against the spirits that stalked the dark tundra. When Kimiko processed her images weeks later in the safety of her hotel, the digital anomalies were still visible. Forms that should not be, faces that could not exist, each more defined at the places where the auroras raged brightest. She learned from the elders that the Inupiat have long believed the northern lights are more than just light. They are the spirits of the dead, or portals to other realms, or the veils of ancient ones who sometimes try to return when the sky opens wide. The villagers told her she had been lucky, or perhaps unlucky, to have come so close. When the sky dances most wildly, an old Inupiaq woman told her, never answer if you hear your name whispered, or the ones in the lights will find a way to pull you through. Kimiko left Utqiagvik with her art portfolio forever changed and her certainty forever shaken. For the rest of her life, she would avoid photographing auroras, unable to shake the feeling that something in the sky had seen her too, and might one day come looking for her when the darkness returned. Thomas Tom Begay had learned about respect from his grandmother long before he ever set foot in Alaska. Growing up on the Navajo Nation in Arizona, he was taught that the land held memories, that certain places demanded acknowledgement, and that ignoring the warnings of elders could bring consequences that lasted generations. When he moved north to pursue his dream of running the Iditarod, he carried those lessons with him, though he never expected to need them in quite the same way. Tom had always been drawn to sled dogs. There was something about their fierce loyalty, their incredible endurance, and their ability to navigate the most treacherous terrain that spoke to him on a fundamental level. After years of training in the lower 48, he finally saved enough money to purchase a team of experienced racing dogs from a musher outside of Fairbanks. The seller, an old Norwegian man named Eric, warned him about certain sections of the trail, but Tom assumed he was talking about natural hazards. Thin ice, sudden weather changes, areas prone to whiteout conditions. It was only later, after he had been living in Alaska for several months and had gotten to know some of the local Inupiaq elders, that he began to understand the deeper meaning behind Eric's warnings. The old Inupiat woman who ran the general store in town, Mary Kunguk, took a liking to Tom, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who understood the importance of traditional knowledge. Over cups of tea during the long winter evenings, she began to share stories that her own grandmother had told her. Stories about places where the spirits of the dead still walked, where ancient things slept beneath the snow, and where even the bravest hunters feared to tread. There are sections of the old trails, Mary told him one evening, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug, where the Tornit once lived. The giant people, the ones who came before us, they were not evil, but they were not human either, and when they left warnings behind. The dogs know. They can smell the old anger, the old sadness. A wise musher listens to his dogs. Tom nodded politely, filing the information away as folklore. Interesting, but not immediately practical. He was focused on training, on building the stamina and teamwork necessary for the 1,000-mile race that would test everything he had learned about survival in the Arctic wilderness. His first real encounter with the supernatural came in late February, during what was supposed to be a routine training run along a section of the Iditarod Trail that wound through dense spruce forest about 50 miles northeast of his base camp. The weather was perfect for mushing, cold but not brutally so, with just enough wind to keep the dogs alert but not enough to create dangerous conditions. His team was running beautifully, moving in perfect synchronization across the packed snow, their breathing steady and their pace sustainable for the long haul. The lead dogs were Nanook and Koda, two experienced Siberian Huskies who had run the Iditarod 3 times with their previous owner. They were intelligent, reliable, and had never given Tom any reason to doubt their judgment, which was why he was so surprised when they suddenly began to slow down, their ears flattening against their heads as they approached what looked like a perfectly ordinary section of trail winding between tall evergreens. At first, Tom assumed they had caught the scent of wildlife, moose perhaps, or a bear den. He called out encouragement, urging them forward, but instead of responding to his voice, both dogs came to a complete stop and began to whimper. The rest of the team bunched up behind them, and within moments, all 12 dogs were showing signs of extreme agitation. Tom set his snow hook and walked up to examine the trail ahead. To his eyes, there was nothing unusual, just the familiar ribbon of packed snow disappearing into the shadows between the trees. The forest was quiet except for the occasional creak of branches in the wind, and the air carried only the clean, sharp scent of snow and pine. But as he stood there trying to understand what had spooked his dogs, he began to feel it too. A subtle wrongness that made his skin crawl and sent his grandmother's warnings echoing through his memory. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, though his thermometer showed no change. The wind died completely, leaving a silence so profound that his own heartbeat sounded thunderous in his ears. And then, from somewhere ahead in the forest, came a sound that made every nerve in his body scream in alarm. A low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Tom's dogs began to howl in unison, a mournful sound that spoke of fear deeper than any natural instinct. Nanook was pulling against his harness, trying desperately to turn the team around, while Koda had dropped to his belly in the snow, trembling with terror. The other dogs were backing up, tangling their lines in their desperate attempt to retreat from whatever lay ahead. As the drumming grew louder, Tom began to hear other sounds layered beneath it, voices singing in a language he did not recognize, the scrape of bone against stone, and something that sounded disturbingly like massive footsteps moving through the forest. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe, and the shadows between the trees began to move in ways that defied the pale light filtering through the canopy. Tom had heard enough stories from his grandmother about respecting the warnings of the spirits to know when he was in over his head. Without hesitation, he pulled up the snow hook and helped turn his terrified team around. The dogs needed no encouragement to run in the opposite direction. They took off at a pace that would have been dangerous under normal circumstances, racing back along the trail as if their lives depended on it. It was only when they had put several miles between themselves and that cursed section of forest that the dogs began to calm down. Tom stopped the team and checked each animal carefully, looking for signs of injury or distress, but aside from elevated heart rates and nervous panting, they seemed physically unharmed. What disturbed him more was the way they kept looking back along the trail. Their ears pricked forward as if listening for sounds of pursuit. That evening, Tom drove into town and sought out Mary Kanguk. He found her at the community center where she was teaching traditional beadwork to a group of local children. When she saw his expression, she dismissed the class early and invited him to walk with her along the frozen shoreline of the lake. "You went to the forbidden place," she said before he had even begun to describe his experience. "I can see it in your eyes. The dogs warned you and you listened. That is good. That shows wisdom." Tom described what he had experienced, and Mary nodded gravely as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "That place has been forbidden for longer than anyone can remember," she finally said. "My grandmother's grandmother told stories of what happened there, back when the world was different. There was a village once, a prosperous place where people lived in harmony with the land and the spirits. But they grew proud, began to take more than they needed, began to ignore the old agreements with the Tornet and the other ancient people." She paused to pull her parka tighter against the wind. "The spirits tried to warn them just as your dogs warned you. But they would not listen. They said the old ways were foolish superstition, that they were strong enough to take whatever they wanted from the land without consequence. So the spirits withdrew their protection, and the Tornet came in the night, not to destroy, but to teach. They drummed the people into the earth, into the trees, into the stones themselves. The village disappeared, but the spirits remained, still drumming, still trying to teach the lesson that pride and disrespect bring only sorrow. Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind. What happened to the people? They became part of the warning, Mary said sadly. Their voices joined the ancient song, adding their own sorrow to the chorus. That is why the dogs fear that place. They can hear the voices of all who ignored the spirit's wisdom, and they know that some paths lead only to becoming lost forever. In the weeks that followed, Tom redesigned his training routes to avoid that section of the trail entirely. He also began to pay closer attention to his dog's instincts, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when they sensed something beyond normal human perception. He discovered that there were several other areas along the traditional trails where his team would show similar signs of unease, though none as dramatic as that first encounter. When race day finally arrived, Tom's team performed beautifully, finishing in the middle of the pack. A respectable showing for a first-time Iditarod Musher. But what he remembered most about the race was not his finishing time or the physical challenges he had overcome. It was the moment, about 2/3 of the way through the race, when the trail took him near the forbidden section of forest. Even from miles away, his dogs began to show signs of nervousness. Nanook kept glancing toward the dark line of trees on the horizon, his ears swiveling as if picking up sounds that Tom could not hear. The entire team picked up their pace without any command from him, as if eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever slept in those shadows. Tom never ran the Iditarod again. He continued to train and race dogs on shorter courses, but something about that experience in the Forbidden Forest had changed his relationship with the wilderness. He had glimpsed something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to human ambition, something that existed according to laws much older than the ones that governed his familiar world. He moved back to Arizona after a few years, where he started a program teaching traditional tracking and outdoor survival skills to young people on the reservation. He always began his classes the same way, with a story about the importance of listening to the warnings of elders, both human and animal. He never mentioned the specific details of what he had encountered in Alaska, but he made sure his students understood that the natural world contained forces that demanded respect, and that ignoring those forces came with consequences that could last for generations. The dogs had saved him by refusing to enter that place where ancient spirits still drummed their warnings into the frozen earth. Tom never forgot that lesson, and he made sure that everyone he taught understood it as well. Some places were meant to be avoided, some paths were not meant to be taken, and the wisdom to know the difference was often the thin line between survival and becoming another voice in the eternal chorus of the lost. The Tornets still walked in those dark woods, still drummed their ancient warnings into the night. And somewhere in the forest, the spirits of those who had ignored their wisdom continued to sing their mournful song, adding their voices to the eternal reminder that pride and disrespect for the old ways would always carry a terrible price. Tom Begay had learned to listen to his dogs, and in doing so had learned to listen to the land itself. It was a lesson he carried with him for the rest of his life. A reminder that true wisdom lay not in conquering the wilderness, but in understanding his place within it and respecting the boundaries that had been set by powers far greater than himself. Caleb O'Sullivan had always been driven by a deep sense of purpose. Growing up in South Boston in an Irish-American family that valued education above almost everything else, he had watched his parents work multiple jobs to put his older siblings through college. When it was his turn, Caleb chose education as his major, determined to make a difference in the lives of children who might not otherwise have access to quality schooling. After graduating from Boston College with his teaching degree, he applied for positions in remote areas where teachers were desperately needed. The offer from Newcomgak, a village of fewer than 200 people situated deep in the Alaskan bush, seemed like exactly the opportunity he had been looking for. The village was so remote that it could only be reached by small aircraft, and the previous teacher had left abruptly in the middle of the academic year without explanation. The school superintendent in Bethel had been honest about the challenges: extreme isolation, harsh weather conditions, and cultural barriers that could make teaching difficult for outsiders. But the salary was competitive, and the chance to make a real impact was undeniable. Caleb arrived in Newcomgak on a cold September morning when the tundra was already showing the first signs of winter's approach. The village consisted of a few dozen small houses clustered around a community center, a general store that also served as the post office, and the school, a modest two-room building that served children from kindergarten through 8th grade. The high school students were sent to boarding schools in larger towns, a practice that had created some tension in the community over the years. The school building itself was newer than most of the other structures in the village, built in the late 1990s with federal funding. It had modern heating, electricity powered by diesel generators, and internet access that worked when weather conditions permitted. Caleb's living quarters were attached to the school in a small apartment that had been designed for visiting teachers. It was sparse but comfortable, with a kitchenette, a sleeping area, and a small office where he could prepare lessons. His students ranged in age from 5 to 14, with a total enrollment of 18 children from 12 families. Most were Yupik, with a few mixed heritage students whose families had moved to the village from other parts of Alaska. Caleb had studied basic Yupik language and cultural practices during his preparation for the position. But he quickly realized that textbook knowledge was very different from the lived reality of teaching in a community where traditional ways of life were still very much alive. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. The children were initially shy around their new teacher, but Caleb's enthusiasm and genuine respect for their culture gradually won them over. He incorporated local knowledge into his lessons, asking elders to visit the classroom to share traditional stories and teaching methods. The parents seemed pleased with his approach, and he began to feel that he was truly making a difference. It was in early October that Caleb first noticed something unusual about his students' artwork. During a free drawing period, he observed that several of the children were creating remarkably similar images. Intricate patterns of spirals and geometric shapes that seemed far too sophisticated for their age levels. When he asked about the drawings, the children would look at each other nervously and mumble that they had learned the patterns from the other teacher. This confused Caleb, since he was the only teacher in the village, and the previous teacher had left months before any of these particular patterns had appeared in their work. When he asked for clarification, 10-year-old Mary Tulamak told him matter-of-factly that the night teacher shows us things when you go to sleep. Intrigued rather than alarmed, Caleb assumed the children were talking about some kind of cultural education that happened outside of school hours. Many indigenous communities had traditional teaching methods that operated parallel to formal education, and he respected the importance of those practices. He made a mental note to speak with some of the village elders about coordinating his curriculum with whatever traditional instruction the children were receiving. But as the weeks passed, the situation became more puzzling. The children began displaying knowledge of subjects that were far beyond their grade levels. Complex mathematical concepts, detailed understanding of astronomical phenomena, and most disturbing of all, the ability to write in what appeared to be a form of ancient script that none of the village elders could identify. The breakthrough came during a parent-teacher conference in late October. Caleb was meeting with Robert and Susan Akaran, the parents of 8-year-old Tommy, when he mentioned the boy's remarkable progress in mathematics. Tommy had begun solving algebraic equations that should have been incomprehensible to a third grader, and when Caleb asked him where he had learned these techniques, Tommy had given the same answer as the other children. The night teacher showed me. Robert and Susan exchanged worried glances. "There is no night teacher," Susan said quietly. We thought Tommy was learning these things from you during regular school hours." That evening, Caleb decided to investigate. He waited in his apartment until he was certain the village was asleep, then quietly made his way into the main classroom. The school was dark and silent, heated only enough to prevent the pipes from freezing. He settled into a chair in the back of the room and waited, telling himself that he would probably see nothing more than shadows cast by the security lighting. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the classroom began to change. The temperature dropped noticeably and a faint phosphorescent glow began emanating from the walls themselves. The desks and chairs rearranged themselves silently into a perfect circle, and symbols began appearing on the blackboard, the same intricate patterns that had been showing up in his students' artwork. Then they began to arrive, not through the doors or windows, but simply materializing in the classroom as if stepping through invisible doorways. They appeared to be children at first glance, but their proportions were subtly wrong. Too tall for their apparent age, with elongated limbs and faces that seemed both ancient and ageless. Their clothing was traditional Yupik style, but appeared to be made from materials that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. The phantom students took their places in the circle of desks and began to study the symbols on the blackboard. Their learning methods were unlike anything Caleb had ever witnessed. They absorbed information directly without the need for repetition or explanation. Complex mathematical formulas, astronomical charts, and linguistic patterns flowed from the blackboard into their consciousness with perfect efficiency. Most disturbing of all was the realization that these spectral children were teaching his students. Real children began to appear in the classroom, not physically, but as translucent projections of themselves, still asleep in their beds but somehow present in this otherworldly classroom. Tommy Akaran was there, along with Mary Tulimak and most of Caleb's other students. They sat in the circle with the phantom children, learning the same impossible lessons with the same supernatural efficiency. Caleb watched in fascination and growing horror as the night school conducted its session. The subjects being taught were far beyond elementary level. Advanced mathematics, quantum physics, ancient history of civilizations that had never existed according to any textbook, and languages that predated human settlement of Alaska. The phantom teacher, who appeared to be an adult version of the same ethereal beings, communicated without speaking, transferring knowledge directly into the minds of both the spectral students and Caleb's real children. The session lasted for exactly 1 hour. At 3:17 a.m., the symbols faded from the blackboard. The desks returned to their normal positions, and both the phantom students and the projections of his real children dissolved back into darkness. Caleb sat alone in the empty classroom, shaking with cold and the implications of what he had witnessed. The next morning, he tried to act normally, but his students seemed to sense that something had changed. They watched him with knowing eyes, as if aware that he had discovered their secret education. Their schoolwork continued to display the same impossible advancement, but now Caleb understood the source of their knowledge. Over the following weeks, he tried to research the phenomenon, reaching out to colleagues, anthropologists, and experts in indigenous spirituality. Most dismissed his account as stress-induced hallucinations or cultural misunderstanding. A few suggested that he might be witnessing some form of ancestral teaching spirit, but none could offer concrete explanations for what was happening in his classroom. The children themselves were reluctant to discuss the night school, responding to his questions with nervous silence or vague statements about learning from the old ones. The village elders were equally evasive, though Caleb sensed that they knew more than they were willing to share with an outsider. The situation came to a head in November, when Caleb realized that the night school was changing his students in ways that went beyond advanced academics. They were becoming detached from normal childhood activities, more interested in abstract concepts than games or social interaction. Their artwork became increasingly alien, depicting landscapes and structures that existed nowhere on Earth. Most troubling of all, they had begun speaking in unison during regular class time, finishing each other's sentences with perfect synchronization as if they shared a collective consciousness. When Caleb tried to address this behavior, the children looked at him with expressions of pity rather than confusion. "You cannot understand yet," Mary Tulamak told him with the grave seriousness of someone much older than 10. "You are still learning the old way." The night teacher says some people take longer to receive the true knowledge. That night, Caleb decided to confront whatever was teaching his students. He entered the classroom before the 2:17 a.m. transformation and positioned himself directly in the center where the circle of desks would form. When the phantom children began to materialize, he stood his ground and spoke directly to their teacher. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you teaching them?" The spectral educator turned its attention to him for the first time, and Caleb felt its consciousness brush against his mind like cold fingers exploring the surface of his thoughts. When it spoke, the words formed inside his head rather than reaching his ears. "We are the ones who came before," the entity communicated. "We are the teachers of the deep knowledge, the wisdom that your people have forgotten. These children are chosen to carry the old learning into the new time. You may join them if you wish to understand." Caleb felt an overwhelming temptation to accept the offer. The knowledge being transmitted was incredibly seductive. Answers to questions that had puzzled humanity for millennia, understanding of natural laws that could revolutionize human civilization. But something in the children's increasingly vacant expressions during daytime hours warned him that this education came with a price that might be too high to pay. "What will happen to them?" he asked. "They will become bridges between the worlds," the entity replied. "They will carry our wisdom to your people when your people are ready to receive it. But first, they must be fully prepared." Caleb understood that fully prepared meant something far more profound than advanced education. The night school was transforming his students into something other than human, gradually replacing their individual consciousnesses with collective knowledge that served purposes he could not comprehend. The next morning, he submitted his resignation to the school district and arranged for emergency transportation out of Nukumgak. He left behind most of his belongings and all of his carefully prepared lesson plans. His official reason was a family emergency, but privately he knew he was fleeing something that threatened his sanity and possibly his soul. The replacement teacher lasted 3 weeks before also requesting emergency transfer. The school district eventually closed the Nukumgak facility, citing declining enrollment and budget constraints. The children were sent to boarding schools in Bethel, where their extraordinary academic abilities were noted but attributed to exceptional individual talent rather than supernatural intervention. Caleb returned to teaching in Massachusetts, but he never forgot the night school or the children whose minds had been opened to knowledge that was not meant for human understanding. Sometimes, late at night when he was grading papers or preparing lessons, he would remember the seductive offer of the phantom teacher and wonder what truths he had walked away from. He kept track of his former students through various channels over the years. Many went on to distinguished careers in science and academia, making discoveries and theoretical breakthroughs that advanced human knowledge in significant ways. But those who knew them personally often commented on their detached, otherworldly demeanor and their tendency to speak as if they were accessing information from sources beyond normal human experience. The night school continued to operate in Nukumgak, even without a formal educational facility. Local pilots reported seeing lights in the abandoned school building during winter nights, and occasionally hunters would encounter children in the wilderness who spoke in languages that had never been cataloged by linguists. The village elders maintained their silence, understanding that some forms of education were too dangerous for outsiders to comprehend. Caleb O'Sullivan had learned that teaching was not always about imparting knowledge to students. Sometimes it was about protecting them from knowledge that could fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. The line between education and transformation was thinner than most people realized, and crossing it meant entering a realm where the familiar boundaries of reality no longer applied. Dr. Priya Chatterjee Moore had always been fascinated by the extremes of human experience. As a climate researcher from the University of Michigan, she specialized in studying the psychological and physiological effects of extreme environments on isolated communities. When the National Science Foundation offered her a summer research grant to study the impact of the midnight sun on sleep patterns in remote Alaskan villages, she jumped at the opportunity. What she discovered during those endless bright days would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between the conscious and unconscious mind. The research station was located near Anaktuvuk Pass, a small Inupiaq village in the heart of the Brooks Range where the sun did not set for nearly 3 months during summer. The facility had been established in the 1980s to support various scientific studies of Arctic conditions, and it offered the perfect base for Dr. Chatterjee Moore's investigation into circadian rhythm disruption in extreme latitudes. Her research methodology was straightforward. Monitor the sleep patterns, dream activity, and psychological well-being of volunteers from the local community during the peak weeks of the midnight sun phenomenon. She had brought sophisticated EEG monitoring equipment, sleep study apparatus, and psychological assessment tools that would allow her to document the effects of continuous daylight on human consciousness. The village elder, Robert Aguk, had given permission for the study after lengthy discussions about its potential benefits to the community. Many residents had experienced sleep difficulties during the midnight sun period, and Dr. Chatterjee Moore's research promised to offer insights that might help future generations cope with the unique challenges of Arctic life. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded according to plan. Dr. Chatterjee Moore established her monitoring protocols, recruited a dozen volunteers ranging in age from teenagers to elders, and began collecting baseline data on their sleep patterns. The results were initially predictable. Most participants showed significant disruption to their normal circadian rhythms with fragmented sleep, increased REM activity, and reports of unusually vivid dreams. But as the study progressed into its 3rd week, when the sun remained perpetually overhead in the pale blue sky, something unprecedented began to emerge from the data. Dr. Chatterjee Moore noticed that her research subjects were not just experiencing disrupted individual sleep patterns. They were beginning to share dream content in ways that should have been impossible according to everything she understood about consciousness and neuroscience. The first indication came during her daily interviews with the participants. Sarah Kunalak, a 28-year-old teacher, described a recurring dream about walking through a vast ice cave filled with glowing symbols carved into the walls. When Dr. Chatterjee Moore interviewed 16-year-old Tommy Aguk later that same day, he described almost identical dream imagery, down to specific details about the arrangement of symbols and the quality of light within the cave. Initially, Dr. Chatterjee Moore assumed this was simply coincidence or perhaps the result of shared cultural imagery. Many indigenous communities had common mythological and spiritual symbols that might naturally appear in dreams. But as she continued collecting data, the shared dream experiences became too frequent and too specific to dismiss as cultural overlap. By the 4th week of the study, all 12 participants were reporting variations of the same core dream narrative. They described finding themselves in a vast underground chamber where dozens of people sat in perfect stillness, their eyes closed but their minds somehow active and aware. In the dreams, the participants could communicate without speaking, sharing thoughts and emotions with perfect clarity. Most disturbing of all, they began to recognize the other dreamers as their fellow research subjects, people they were meeting in some kind of shared unconscious space. Dr. Chatterjee Moore's EEG monitoring confirmed that something extraordinary was happening. During the hours when participants reported shared dreaming experiences, their brainwave patterns showed remarkable synchronization. The alpha and theta waves that typically indicated deep sleep states were occurring simultaneously across multiple subjects, even when they were sleeping in different locations throughout the village. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chatterjee Moore decided to monitor her own sleep patterns using the same equipment. As someone who had grown up in Michigan and had never experienced the midnight sun phenomenon, she expected to show different patterns from the local residents. Instead, she found herself drawn into the same shared dream space that her research subjects had been describing. The experience was unlike anything she had ever encountered in her scientific career. In the dream, she found herself standing in the vast underground chamber, surrounded by the sleeping figures of her research participants and dozens of other people she did not recognize. The space felt more real than reality itself, filled with a kind of crystalline clarity that made normal waking consciousness seem foggy and incomplete by comparison. In the center of the chamber stood a figure that seemed to be composed of pure light. Not the harsh brightness of the midnight sun, but a soft golden radiance that conveyed warmth and ancient wisdom. When the entity spoke, its words formed directly in Dr. Chatterjee Moore's mind rather than reaching her through her ears. "You have come to study the effects of endless light on the human mind," the entity communicated. "But you have discovered something far more significant. When the barriers between day and night dissolve, other boundaries become permeable as well. The midnight sun opens doorways that remain closed during the normal cycle of light and darkness." Dr. Chatterjee Moore found herself able to respond through pure thought. "What kind of doorways? What is this place?" "This is the collective unconscious made manifest," the entity replied. "A space where individual minds can meet and share experiences across the boundaries of physical existence. Your people call it dreaming, but it is more than that. It is a return to the original state of human consciousness, before you learn to separate yourselves from each other and from the deeper rhythms of the natural world." As the entity spoke, Dr. Chatterjee Moore became aware that she could perceive the thoughts and emotions of everyone else in the chamber. She felt the deep connection between the Inupiaq participants and their ancestral land, the way their consciousness was intimately linked to the cycles of Arctic life. She experienced the dreams of people she had never met, hunters and shamans and storytellers from previous generations who seemed to exist in this space outside of normal time. Most remarkably, she began to understand that the midnight sun was not just an astronomical phenomenon, but a doorway into a different kind of awareness. The constant daylight dissolved the normal boundaries between conscious and unconscious states, allowing minds to merge and share experiences in ways that were impossible under normal circumstances. When Dr. Chatterjee Moore woke from the shared dream, she found that her research data had been fundamentally transformed. The EEG readings showed that during the shared dreaming periods, her participants' brain activity had synchronized not just with each other, but with natural electromagnetic patterns in the Earth's magnetic field. The midnight sun was somehow facilitating a form of consciousness that connected human awareness directly to planetary rhythms. Over the final weeks of her study, Dr. Chatterjee Moore documented increasingly sophisticated forms of shared dreaming. Participants began to report prophetic dreams that accurately predicted weather patterns, wildlife movements, and other natural phenomena. They described receiving knowledge from deceased relatives and ancestors, information that later proved to be historically accurate when checked against tribal records. Most significantly, the participants began to demonstrate enhanced empathy and emotional connection in their waking lives. Conflicts that had existed in the community for years were resolved as people gained direct insight into each other's thoughts and feelings through their shared dream experiences. children began showing advanced understanding of traditional ecological knowledge that typically took years to acquire through conventional learning. When the midnight sun period finally ended and normal day-night cycles returned, the shared dreaming experiences gradually faded. Dr. Chatterjee Moore's participants retained memories of their collective unconscious adventures, but they could no longer access that state of merged awareness. The EEG synchronization disappeared, and individual dream patterns returned to normal variations. Dr. Chatterjee Moore returned to Michigan with data that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, individual identity, and the relationship between human awareness and natural cycles. When she attempted to publish her findings in mainstream scientific journals, her work was rejected as unscientific and impossible to replicate under controlled laboratory conditions. But she continued her research, focusing on indigenous communities in extreme environments where normal boundaries of human experience were stretched to their limits. She discovered similar phenomena in other polar regions, high-altitude locations, and places where natural light cycles were dramatically different from temperate zone norms. The midnight sun had taught her that human consciousness was far more flexible and interconnected than Western science had assumed. In environments where normal barriers dissolved, minds could merge and share experiences in ways that pointed toward a more fundamental unity underlying individual awareness. Dr. Chatterjee Moore never forgot the feeling of perfect connection she had experienced in the shared dream space beneath the endless Arctic sun. It had shown her that the boundaries between self and other, between past and present, between human consciousness and natural rhythms, were far more permeable than most people realized. The midnight sun continued to rise over Nuktuvuk Pass every summer, offering the same opportunity for expanded awareness to anyone willing to surrender their normal assumptions about the nature of consciousness and individual identity. Some doorways she had learned only opened when the familiar patterns of light and darkness were replaced by the eternal radiance of the Arctic summer.